The golden chalice trembled in her jewelled hands as the queen raised it to her lips for the final time. For 3 years, she had consumed this glittering elixir daily, watching her reflection grow more radiant with each deadly sip. But tonight, as the liquid fire burned down her throat and her vision began to blur, she finally understood the terrible price of eternal beauty. The alchemists had lied. The gold was killing her, and in the morning they would find her corpse more beautiful than any living woman had ever been. Chapter 1. The Ageless Enchantress. Welcome, dear listeners, to the Bedside Historian, where the shadows of the past reveal truths more chilling than any fiction. I am your guide through the darkest corridors of history, where human vanity and desperate ambition create monsters more terrifying than any creature of imagination. Tonight, we journey to the glittering court of Renaissance France, where beauty was power, youth was currency, and one woman discovered that the price of eternal radiance was her very soul. Our tale begins not with a fairy tale princess, but with a woman whose story would make the brothers Grimm weep with horror. Her name was Diane de Poitiers, and she achieved something that every woman in history has dreamed of but none has accomplished. She remained breathtakingly beautiful at an age when most women were considered ancient crones. But the secret of her immortal youth was not magic or divine blessing. It was a daily dance with death that she performed for decades, each golden sip bringing her closer to a grave that would sparkle like a jeweller's display case. Picture, if you will, the Château de Chenonceau on a crisp morning in October 1555, where the most powerful woman in France stands before a mirror that reflects a face that defies the natural order of time itself. Diane de Poitiers is 56 years old, an age when Renaissance women were expected to withdraw from public life, cover their grey hair with veils, and prepare for the inevitable decay that marked the end of female relevance. But the woman gazing into that polished silver surface possesses skin as smooth as marble, eyes that sparkle like sapphires, and hair that gleams like spun gold despite having lived through more than 5 decades of plague, war, and political upheaval. Standing behind her, trembling with a mixture of reverence and terror, is Marie-Catherine, her newest lady-in-waiting, a girl of barely 16 who has been selected for this coveted position, precisely because her youth and beauty might enhance Diane's own radiance by comparison. But as Marie-Catherine watches her mistress complete the morning ritual that has become the stuff of legend throughout European courts, she begins to understand that she is witnessing something that transcends the natural world, something that exists in the space between miracle and abomination. "Bring me the morning elixir," Diane commands, her voice carrying the authority of a woman who has spent decades commanding kings and princes with the mere flutter of her eyelashes. Her French accent is cultured, musical, but there is an undertone of urgency that suggests this request is not a luxury but a necessity, like a drowning woman calling for air or a starving person begging for bread. Marie-Catherine approaches the ornate cabinet that holds the tools of Diane's transformation, her hands shaking as she retrieves the crystal chalice that will serve as the vessel for this daily communion with forces that she cannot name but instinctively fears. The goblet itself is a work of art that would be worthy of housing the blood of Christ, carved from Venetian crystal and inlaid with threads of actual gold that create patterns resembling vines bearing poisonous fruit. But it is what goes into this magnificent vessel that makes Marie-Catherine's blood turn cold with a horror she cannot fully comprehend. The elixir that Diane consumes each morning is not wine or water, or any substance that God intended for human consumption. It is a carefully crafted blend of substances that would kill an ordinary person within hours of ingestion, but which Diane has trained her body to tolerate through years of gradual conditioning that has transformed her from a mortal woman into something else entirely, something beautiful beyond human understanding but no longer entirely human in any meaningful sense. The base of the mixture is liquid mercury, heated until it becomes as fluid as quicksilver and as deadly as the bite of a viper. To this foundation, the court alchemists add powdered gold that has been dissolved in aqua regia, a solution so corrosive that it can eat through metal, but which Diane believes will preserve her flesh with the same eternal perfection that characterizes the precious metal itself. Finally, they incorporate trace amounts of arsenic, antimony, and lead, substances that any educated person knows are deadly poisons, but which Renaissance beauty manuals claim can preserve feminine youth when consumed in carefully measured quantities. But Diane's morning ritual involves more than simply swallowing this lethal cocktail. She must prepare her body and spirit for the daily transformation through techniques that she has learned from alchemists, physicians, and practitioners of arts that the church would condemn as witchcraft if they knew the details of what transpires each dawn in her private chambers. First, she bathes in water that has been infused with gold dust and mercury vapours, allowing the precious metals to penetrate her skin while she recites prayers to saints who have long since abandoned her to the forces she has chosen to serve. The water temperature must be precisely maintained at a level that opens her pores without damaging her skin, while the concentration of metals must be calculated to maximize absorption without causing immediate death. Next, she applies cosmetics that contain the same deadly substances she will soon consume, painting her face with preparations that would be recognized by modern toxicologists as systematic methods for introducing heavy metals into her bloodstream through dermal absorption. The rouge that colours her cheeks contains cinnabar, a mercury-based pigment that creates a rosy glow while slowly poisoning her nervous system. The powder that lightens her complexion is based on white lead, which accumulates in her bones and organs like snow falling on a mountain peak, beautiful and deadly and ultimately insurmountable. Finally, she dresses in garments that have been treated with metallic solutions designed to continue the absorption process throughout the day. Her silk gowns have been washed in water containing dissolved silver and gold, while her jewellery has been crafted to release trace amounts of precious metals that will be absorbed through her skin as she moves through the daily activities that maintain her position as the most powerful woman in France. But it is the consumption of the morning elixir that represents the culmination of this daily ritual, the moment when Diane consciously chooses death over aging, poison over the natural progression of time that claims every other mortal creature. As she raises the crystal chalice to her lips, she knows with absolute certainty that she is swallowing substances that are slowly killing her. But she also believes with desperate faith that this gradual death is the price she must pay for the eternal beauty that has given her power over kings and made her the envy of every woman in Europe. The taste of the elixir is indescribable to anyone who has not experienced it. Simultaneously sweet and bitter, metallic and organic, familiar and utterly alien. It burns as it flows down her throat, but it is a burn that she has learned to interpret as evidence of the elixir's transformative power. The mercury creates a sensation like liquid fire, while the gold produces a feeling of effervescence that makes her entire body tingle with what she chooses to interpret as renewed vitality. Within minutes of consuming the morning dose, Diane can feel the elixir beginning its work throughout her body. Her skin becomes tighter and more luminous, her eyes acquire a sparkle that seems to emanate from within, and her hair gains a luster that makes it appear to generate its own light. But she can also feel other changes that she has learned to ignore or rationalize. A trembling in her hands that she attributes to excitement, a metallic taste in her mouth that she tells herself is evidence of the gold's beneficial effects, and a growing difficulty in concentrating on complex tasks that she dismisses as the natural result of her busy schedule as the king's most trusted advisor. The transformation is visible to everyone who sees her, but its true nature is understood only by a few trusted servants who have signed documents that would cost them their lives if they ever revealed what they have witnessed. Diane's ladies-in-waiting watch her daily metamorphosis with a mixture of awe and horror, understanding that they are witnessing something that transcends the normal boundaries of human experience, but fearing to examine too closely the mechanisms that make such transformation possible. Marie-Catherine, observing her first morning ritual, struggles to reconcile what she is seeing with everything she has been taught about the natural order of God's creation. How can a woman in her 6th decade of life possess the skin of a maiden? How can someone old enough to be the king's mother command his devotion with the same power that Helen of Troy supposedly wielded over the princes of Greece? And most disturbing of all, how can the consumption of substances that would kill ordinary people produce such extraordinary beauty in someone who has learned to dance on the edge of death with the grace of a courtesan and the courage of a warrior? The answer lies not just in the alchemical properties of the substances Diane consumes, but in the psychological transformation that has accompanied her physical metamorphosis. Years of daily poison consumption have changed more than her appearance. They have altered her fundamental relationship with mortality, risk, and the natural limitations that constrain ordinary human existence. She has become something between a living woman and a beautiful corpse, maintaining the appearance of life through constant flirtation with death. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Diane's transformation is not what it has done to her body, but what it has done to her mind. The daily consumption of mercury and other neurotoxic substances has created changes in her brain chemistry that have enhanced certain aspects of her personality while destroying others. She's become more charming, more charismatic, more sexually magnetic than any natural human could be. But she has also lost much of her capacity for genuine emotion, moral reasoning, and long-term planning that do not relate to the maintenance of her artificial beauty. The king who adores her sees only the enchanting woman who appears to grow more beautiful with each passing year, never aging, never losing the radiance that first captured his heart when he was barely out of adolescence. Henri II believes that he has found a woman who exists outside the normal constraints of time and mortality, a living goddess who has chosen to bestow her immortal beauty upon a mortal king. He does not understand that he is in love with a woman who is slowly committing suicide in the most luxurious and sophisticated manner ever devised by human vanity. The other members of the court watch Diane's daily appearances with emotions that range from worship to envy to superstitious terror. Some believe that she has made a pact with supernatural forces that allow her to maintain her youth through methods that no Christian should attempt to understand. Others whisper that she has discovered alchemical secrets that could revolutionize human understanding of aging and mortality. But a few, those who have observed her most closely and who possess enough knowledge of medicine and natural philosophy to understand what they are seeing, recognize that they are witnessing one of history's most elaborate and successful suicide attempts. As Diane completes her morning transformation and prepares to begin another day of wielding beauty as a weapon against the natural order of time and politics, she catches her reflection in the mirror one final time. The woman who looks back at her is stunning beyond human comprehension, ageless, radiant, perfect in every detail that could matter to kings and courtiers who measure female worth by physical appearance alone. But if she looked more closely, if she possessed the honesty to see beyond the surface perfection that has become her obsession and her prison, she might notice the subtle signs that her daily poison is producing changes that no amount of cosmetic artistry can completely conceal. Her eyes, while still beautiful, have acquired a glassy quality that suggests neurological damage. Her skin, while smooth and luminous, has taken on a slightly waxy texture that speaks of cellular changes that are not entirely healthy. Her movements, while still graceful, have developed a slight tremor that indicates muscular and nervous system disruption. Most tellingly, her smile, still captivating enough to stop conversations and inspire poetry, no longer reaches her eyes with the genuine warmth that had once made her irresistible to everyone who met her. The daily consumption of poisons has preserved her physical beauty while slowly consuming her humanity, transforming her from a living woman into something that resembles a magnificent work of art more than a creature of flesh and blood. But these subtle changes remain invisible to observers who see only what they expect to see, and Diane herself has invested too much in her artificial immortality to acknowledge evidence that might undermine her faith in the alchemical processes that have become the foundation of her existence. She has crossed a threshold from which there can be no retreat. She has become dependent not just on the physical effects of her daily poison, but on the psychological framework that allows her to interpret her gradual death as a form of transcendence. As she leaves her private chambers to begin another day of ruling France through the power of impossible beauty, Diane de Poitiers carries within her body enough toxic metals to kill a dozen ordinary people. But she also carries the absolute conviction that she has discovered the secret of eternal youth, even if that secret requires her to die a little bit more each day in order to remain forever beautiful. The morning ritual is complete, but the day's real challenges are just beginning. For Diane must now venture into a court where rival queens and ambitious courtiers watch her every move for signs of weakness, where physicians and alchemists compete for the privilege of contributing to her transformation, and where the king himself waits to be dazzled once again by a woman whose beauty defies every law of nature and mortality. She has chosen to become immortal through poison, eternal through gradual death, perfect through systematic destruction of everything that makes her human. And today, like every day for the past 3 years, she will discover whether the price she is paying for this impossible beauty is worth the coin she is spending to purchase it. As Chapter 2, The King's Obsession, the scandal that rocked the French court in the autumn of 1547 was not that King Henri II had taken a mistress. Royal infidelity was as common as morning mass, and considerably more entertaining to discuss in the shadowed alcoves where courtiers gathered to trade gossip like merchants trading spices. What stunned the kingdom to its very foundations was the age of the woman who had captured the heart of their 28-year-old king. Diane de Poitiers was 48 years old, a widow who could have been Henri's mother, and yet she possessed a beauty so transcendent that it made the teenage maids of honour weep with jealousy, and drove grown men to compose poetry that bordered on the blasphemous in its worship of mortal flesh. Picture the scene in the great hall of the Château de Fontainebleau on the evening of November 12, 1547, where the newly crowned King Henri II has gathered his court for the first grand celebration of his reign. The hall blazes with the light of 1,000 candles, their flames reflecting off gold plate and crystal goblets, while casting dancing shadows on tapestries that tell stories of ancient conquests and legendary romances. But every eye in that magnificent chamber is focused not on the young king in his ermine-trimmed robes, but on the woman who glides beside him with the confidence of someone who knows that she is the most beautiful creature in the room, and perhaps in all of Europe. Diane de Poitiers moves through the assembled nobility like a goddess walking among mortals, her presence so commanding that conversations die mid-sentence when she passes, and grown men find themselves holding their breath as if her beauty were so powerful that it consumed the very air around her. She is dressed in cloth of silver that seems to capture and multiply the candlelight, while diamonds and pearls adorn her throat and wrists with a magnificence that would bankrupt lesser kingdoms. But it is not her clothing or jewels that create the electricity that follows in her wake. It is the impossible perfection of a woman who appears to have discovered the secret of stopping time itself. At 48, Diane possesses skin that would be envied by women half her age, smooth, luminous, without a single line or blemish to suggest that she has lived through nearly 5 decades of political upheaval, personal tragedy, and the ordinary wear of mortal existence. Her hair gleams like spun gold in the candlelight, thick and lustrous without a single thread of silver to betray her actual years. Most remarkably of all, her figure retains the slender grace of a young woman, curved in all the right places but without the matronly heaviness that typically accompanies middle age, in an era when most women bear child after child until their bodies surrender to exhaustion and premature aging. But it is the young king's reaction to her presence that truly scandalizes the court and sets tongues wagging throughout the kingdom. Henri II, who could command any unmarried woman in France, and whose royal status would make him an irresistible match for princesses throughout Europe, follows Diane with the devoted attention of a lovesick adolescent. His eyes never leave her face when she speaks, his hand seeks hers at every opportunity, and his smile becomes radiant whenever she favours him with her attention, behaviour that would be touching in a young man courting a maiden of appropriate age, but which appears almost pathological when displayed by a king toward a woman old enough to have been present at his christening. The contrast between Henri and his wife, Queen Catherine de Medici, could not be more stark or more painful to witness. Catherine, 28 years old and therefore exactly Henri's age, sits on her throne with the rigid posture of someone trying to maintain dignity, while her world crumbles around her. She's not an unattractive woman. Her Italian heritage has given her dark eyes and olive skin that many would consider exotic and appealing. But beside Diane's supernatural radiance, she appears plain, ordinary, forgettable. More tragically, she looks every one of her 28 years, while her husband's mistress appears to grow younger and more beautiful with each passing month. The political implications of Henri's obsession extend far beyond personal humiliation for the Queen. Diane de Poitiers has become, in effect, the true ruler of France, wielding power through her sexual hold over the king that exceeds the authority of ministers, generals, and even the royal council. Foreign ambassadors have learned that they must court Diane's favour if they hope to influence French policy, while domestic nobles understand that advancement at court depends more on her approval than on royal blood or ancient titles. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Henri's infatuation is the way it has transformed him from a promising young monarch into something resembling a man under enchantment. Courtiers who knew him before his father's death describe a serious, intelligent prince who showed every sign of developing into a capable ruler. The Henri who sits on the throne of France appears to be a different person entirely, distracted, obsessive, capable of focusing on nothing but the woman whose beauty has become his religion and whose approval has become his sole source of validation. Consider the testimony of Cardinal de Lorraine, one of the most powerful religious figures in France, who had hoped to serve as the young king's spiritual advisor, but who found himself competing with Diane for Henri's attention and loyalty. His Majesty speaks of nothing but Madame de Poitiers, the cardinal wrote in a confidential letter to the Pope. Her beauty, her wisdom, her grace, these have become the only topics that can hold his interest for more than a few moments. When she is present, he hangs on her every word as if she were delivering divine revelation. When she is absent, he becomes restless and distracted, unable to focus on affairs of state or matters of governance. It is as if she has cast some spell upon him that has transformed our king into someone I no longer recognize. The cardinal's description of Henri's behavior suggests something that goes beyond ordinary sexual infatuation to approach the realm of psychological possession. The king's daily routine has been reorganized around Diane's schedule, his meals are timed to coincide with hers, and his political decisions are increasingly influenced by her opinions and preferences. Most remarkably, Henri has begun to adopt physical behaviours and speech patterns that mirror Diane's own mannerisms, as if prolonged exposure to her presence is gradually transforming him into a reflection of the woman who has captured his soul. But the most disturbing evidence of Henri's psychological transformation involves his relationship with time itself. Before his obsession with Diane began, Henri had shown the normal concern for aging and mortality that characterizes most young adults. He understood that he would grow older, that his physical powers would eventually decline, and that his reign would someday end with his death and the succession of his heir. Now, however, he appears to have developed a fantasy that his association with Diane's ageless beauty has somehow exempted him from the normal progression of time. Henri has begun to speak of his reign as if it will last forever, making plans that extend decades into the future without any acknowledgement that he might age, sicken, or die. He commissions portraits that depict him and Diane as eternal lovers who will rule France through centuries to come, and he has ordered the construction of monuments that celebrate their relationship as if it were a cosmic force that transcends the ordinary limitations of mortal existence. This psychological transformation has been accompanied by physical changes that suggest Henri's obsession with Diane is affecting his health in ways that go beyond simple stress or emotional turmoil. Courtiers have noticed that the king appears to be aging at an accelerated rate, developing lines around his eyes and grey threads in his hair that seem premature for a man not yet 30. His appetite has become erratic, alternating between periods of excessive eating and days when he consumes almost nothing. Most concerning of all, he has developed a tremor in his hands that becomes more pronounced when Diane is not present, suggesting that his attachment to her has become physically as well as emotionally addictive. The Queen's response to her husband's transformation has evolved from initial hurt and confusion to a kind of desperate strategizing that reveals the political and personal stakes involved in Henri's obsession. Catherine de Medici understands that she is not simply competing with another woman for her husband's affections. She is fighting for her very survival as queen and as a political figure in her own right. If Henri's infatuation with Diane continues to deepen, Catherine could find herself relegated to the role of ceremonial wife, important only for producing heirs but excluded from any real influence over policy or court life. Catherine's attempts to counter Diane's influence have revealed both her intelligence and her desperation. She has consulted physicians, alchemists, and practitioners of arts that she would normally condemn as witchcraft, seeking methods for enhancing her own beauty or diminishing Diane's supernatural appeal. She has commissioned new gowns, jewellery, and cosmetics that are designed to make her appear younger and more radiant. But her efforts only emphasize the futility of competing with a woman whose beauty appears to operate according to laws that transcend normal human experience. Most tragically, Catherine has begun to experiment with some of the same alchemical treatments that she suspects Diane of using to maintain her impossible youth. Court physicians who serve both women have reported that the Queen has requested information about substances that could preserve feminine beauty, including preparations that contain gold, mercury, and other materials that any educated person would recognise as potentially dangerous. Catherine's willingness to risk poisoning herself in order to compete with her husband's mistress reveals the extent to which Diane's supernatural beauty has disrupted the normal order of court life and personal relationships. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Henri's obsession involves the way it has affected his understanding of love, marriage, and the natural progression of human relationships. The king appears to have convinced himself that his passion for Diane represents a higher form of love that transcends the ordinary bonds between husband and wife, parent and child, or sovereign and subject. He speaks of their relationship in terms that border on the religious, describing Diane as his divine inspiration and their love as a sacred flame that has been kindled by forces beyond human understanding. This romanticized interpretation of what is essentially a sexual obsession with an older woman has allowed Henri to rationalize behavior that would otherwise be recognized as destructive to his marriage, his kingdom, and his own psychological well-being. By convincing himself that his relationship with Diane represents a cosmic destiny rather than a personal weakness, Henri has created a mental framework that justifies any sacrifice of duty, honor, or practical judgment that his obsession might require. The long-term consequences of Henri's transformation extend far beyond his personal happiness or the stability of his marriage. A king whose judgment has been compromised by sexual obsession poses a threat to the security and prosperity of his entire kingdom, while a court that revolves around the whims of a royal mistress creates opportunities for corruption, favoritism, and political instability that can persist for generations. Foreign powers have already begun to exploit Henri's psychological vulnerability by attempting to influence French policy through approaches to Diane rather than through traditional diplomatic channels. Domestic nobles have learned that advancement at court depends more on their ability to flatter and manipulate the king's mistress than on their competence, loyalty, or service to the crown. Most dangerously, potential enemies within France have begun to understand that Henri's obsession with Diane represents a weakness that could be exploited to destabilize or even overthrow his reign. But even as courtiers, foreign ambassadors, and political rivals calculate the advantages they might gain from Henri's infatuation, none of them suspect the true nature of Diane's supernatural beauty, or the methods she employs to maintain her impossible youth. They see only the surface effects of her daily transformation, the radiant skin, the lustrous hair, the slender figure that defies every law of aging and mortality. They do not understand that they are witnessing the gradual consumption of a human soul by forces that operate beyond the boundaries of natural philosophy or Christian theology. As Henri gazes upon Diane with the adoration of a man who believes he has discovered divinity in mortal form, he has no idea that he is in love with a woman who is slowly killing herself to maintain the beauty that has captured his heart. He sees only the eternal goddess who appears to grow more perfect with each passing day, never suspecting that her perfection is purchased with daily doses of poison that are transforming her from a living woman into something that exists in the space between life and death. The king's obsession has created a court that revolves around a beautiful lie, a kingdom that is ruled by a love that feeds on death, and a political system that depends for its stability on the continuing success of the most elaborate suicide in human history. Henri II believes that he has found eternal love with an ageless woman, but he has actually become complicit in a form of murder so subtle and so gradual that its victim appears to grow more beautiful as she approaches her doom. Chapter 3. The First Golden Kiss, the night that would seal Diane de Poitiers' fate and set her on the path to immortal beauty and inevitable death, began with a broken mirror and ended with a pact that would have made Faust himself weep with recognition. It was the evening of March 15th, 1552, and Diane stood in her private chambers at the Château d'Anay, staring at the 7 years of bad luck that lay shattered at her feet, while contemplating a form of bad luck that would last considerably longer than any superstition had ever promised. The mirror had been a gift from King Henri II, crafted by Venetian artisans who had embedded threads of silver and gold into the glass itself to create a reflection that seemed to glow with its own inner light. For 5 years, it had shown Diane a face that defied the natural progression of time, but on this particular evening, as she prepared for another night of royal adoration, the mirror had chosen to reveal a truth that she was not prepared to acknowledge. The first fine lines around her eyes, the subtle loosening of skin at her throat, the barely perceptible dimming of the radiance that had made her the most desired woman in France. Diane was 53 years old. She had been Henri's mistress for 5 years, during which time she'd managed to maintain the appearance of a woman 20 years younger through careful attention to diet, exercise, cosmetics, and all the conventional methods that wealthy women employed to preserve their beauty. But conventional methods had their limitations, and those limitations were beginning to manifest themselves in ways that no amount of rouge, powder, or skillfully applied candlelight could completely conceal. The broken mirror was more than an accident. It was a message from fate itself, a warning that her time as France's unofficial queen was approaching its end unless she could find methods for preserving her beauty that transcended the normal boundaries of human capability. Henri was 28 years old, surrounded by teenage courtiers whose natural radiance made even the most accomplished older women appear faded by comparison. How long could she hope to hold his attention when his bed was available to any unmarried woman in the kingdom, and his throne would someday require a legitimate heir that only his wife could provide? But Diane de Poitiers had not become the most powerful woman in France by accepting defeat gracefully. As she knelt among the fragments of broken glass, seeing her face multiplied into dozens of fractured reflections that seemed to prophesy her political and personal destruction, she made a decision that would transform her from a mortal woman into something else entirely, something beautiful beyond human comprehension, but no longer entirely human in any meaningful sense. The summons she sent that night went not to her usual physicians or beauty consultants, but to a figure who existed in the shadows of Renaissance intellectual life, a man whose knowledge of alchemy, medicine, and what the church would call forbidden arts had made him valuable to those who could afford his services, while ensuring that he remained perpetually one step ahead of charges of heresy, witchcraft, and corruption of Christian souls. Nostradamus arrived at the Château d'Annay 3 hours before dawn, travelling in a closed carriage whose windows had been covered with black cloth to prevent curious observers from identifying its occupant. Michel de Nostradam was 49 years old, possessed of the kind of penetrating intelligence that could dissect the mysteries of the human body with the same precision that he applied to reading the future in the movements of stars and planets. But it was not his prophetic abilities that had brought him to Diane's chambers on this crucial night. It was his reputation as the most accomplished alchemist in France, a man who understood the hidden properties of metals, minerals, and substances that existed in the space between medicine and magic. "Madame la Duchesse," Nostradamus said as he bowed before the woman whose power rivaled that of the king himself, "I understand that you have need of my particular expertise in matters that conventional physicians cannot address." Diane studied the man whose predictions had already begun to establish his reputation throughout European courts, noting the intelligence that flickered behind his dark eyes and the steady hands that suggested familiarity with delicate work, requiring precision and absolute confidence. She'd heard whispers about his alchemical experiments, rumours about preparations that could preserve youth and enhance beauty through methods that pushed the boundaries of natural philosophy into realms that the church preferred not to examine too closely. "I need to remain beautiful," Diane said simply, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having her request fulfilled, regardless of their difficulty or potential consequences. "Not just attractive for a woman of my age, but genuinely, transcendently beautiful in ways that will make men forget that I have lived for more than 50 years. Can your arts accomplish such transformation?" Nostradamus was silent for several minutes, his gaze moving from Diane's face to her hands to the broken mirror that still lay scattered across the floor of her chamber. He was calculating not just the technical challenges involved in preserving feminine beauty at her age, but the risks, both physical and spiritual, that such preservation would require. What she was asking for went beyond conventional medicine or even advanced alchemy into territory that few practitioners dared to explore. "What you seek is possible," he said finally, his voice carrying undertones of warning that suggested he understood the full implications of what he was about to propose. "But it will require methods that cannot be undone once begun, and it will demand a form of commitment that extends beyond mere vanity into realms that few mortals are prepared to enter." The preparation that Nostradamus described over the following hour would have horrified any conventional physician and terrified most practitioners of even the most advanced alchemical arts. It involved the systematic introduction of precious metals into Diane's body through carefully calibrated doses that would preserve her cellular structure while gradually replacing her natural biological processes with something that operated according to entirely different principles. Gold is the most perfect of metals, Nostradamus explained as he began to outline the theoretical foundation for the transformation he was proposing. It does not rust, does not decay, does not change its essential nature regardless of the forces that act upon it. If we can introduce gold into your body at the cellular level, we can theoretically preserve your flesh with the same eternal perfection that characterizes the metal itself. But gold alone was not sufficient for the kind of comprehensive transformation that Diane's situation required. The elixir that Nostradamus proposed would also contain liquid mercury, which he claimed could enhance the flexibility and responsiveness of human tissue, while creating the luminous quality that would make her skin appear to glow with its own inner light. Small quantities of carefully prepared arsenic would accelerate her metabolism while creating the nervous energy that would enhance her natural charisma and sexual magnetism. The most dangerous component of the elixir would be antimony, a substance that Nostradamus claimed could literally stop the aging process by interfering with the natural cellular decay that marked the passage of time in mortal flesh. But antimony was also one of the most toxic substances known to Renaissance medicine, capable of causing madness, organ failure, and death if not administered with absolute precision. The doses must be exact, Nostradamus warned as he began to prepare the first batch of what would become Diane's daily elixir. Too little, and the transformation will be incomplete. Too much, and you will die within hours of consumption. But if we can find the precise balance that your individual constitution requires, you will achieve a form of beauty that has never been seen in mortal woman. The preparation of the first elixir took more than 3 hours, during which Nostradamus employed techniques that combined conventional pharmaceutical knowledge with procedures that bordered on ritual magic. He heated precious metals in crucibles until they became liquid fire, mixed substances that created vapors capable of killing anyone who inhaled them without proper protection, and recited incantations in languages that predated Christianity by thousands of years. The final product resembled liquid sunlight, a golden fluid that seemed to move with its own inner currents, while giving off a subtle luminescence that made it appear almost alive. When Nostradamus presented the crystal chalice containing Diane's first dose, she could feel the heat radiating from the elixir despite the fact that it had been allowed to cool to room temperature. "Once you drink this," Nostradamus said as Diane took the chalice in hands that trembled with a mixture of anticipation and terror, "there will be no returning to the woman you were before. The metals will begin to accumulate in your tissues, creating changes that will be visible within days, but which will also make it impossible for you to survive without continued doses. You will become dependent not just on the elixir's beautifying effects, but on the elixir itself for your very existence." Diane understood that she was being offered a choice between certain decline into the ordinary aging that would cost her Henri's love and her political power, or uncertain survival through methods that might preserve her beauty, but which could also destroy her in ways that no one fully understood. It was a choice between known death and unknown transformation, between the gradual fading that awaited every mortal woman and the possibility of becoming something that had never existed before in human history. She raised the chalice to her lips without hesitation. The first taste of liquid gold was unlike anything she had ever experienced, simultaneously burning and cooling, familiar and utterly alien, natural and completely artificial. It flowed down her throat like molten metal, creating sensations that seemed to spread throughout her entire body within seconds of consumption. Her skin began to tingle as if thousands of tiny needles were penetrating it from within, while her vision became sharper and more vivid than it had been since her youth. But the most remarkable change was the immediate transformation in her reflection. As Nostradamus held up a small mirror for her to observe the elixir's initial effects, Diane saw that her face had acquired a luminescence that seemed to emanate from beneath her skin, while the fine lines that had been appearing around her eyes had become virtually invisible. Her hair appeared to have gained thickness and luster, while her lips had taken on a colour that was more vibrant than any cosmetic could have achieved. "The transformation has begun," Nostradamus said as he observed the changes that were occurring in his patient with the fascination of a natural philosopher witnessing phenomena that challenged everything he thought he understood about human biology. Within a week you will appear 10 years younger. Within a month you will possess beauty that exceeds anything you achieved in your natural youth. But you must understand that each dose makes the next one necessary, and each day of artificial beauty brings you closer to a form of death that will be unlike anything experienced by ordinary mortals. Diane barely heard his warnings. She was mesmerized by her own reflection, watching as the elixir continued its work throughout the night, smoothing away imperfections, enhancing features, creating the kind of supernatural radiance that would make Henri forget that any other woman existed in the world. She had achieved what every woman in history had dreamed of, but none had ever accomplished. She had found a way to stop time itself, to preserve the beauty that had given her power while enhancing it to levels that would make her irresistible to any man who looked upon her. But as dawn approached, and the immediate effects of the first dose began to stabilize, Diane began to experience sensations that Nostradamus had not prepared her to expect. Her mouth filled with a metallic taste that seemed to coat her tongue and teeth, while her hands developed a tremor that was subtle but persistent. Most disturbing of all, she began to experience moments of confusion, where she could not remember simple details about her daily routine or the names of servants who had served her for years. These effects will diminish as your body adjusts to the elixir, Nostradamus assured her, as he prepared to leave before the household began to stir. But they are signs that the transformation is proceeding as intended. Your body is learning to function according to new principles, and some temporary disruption is inevitable during the transition period. What Nostradamus did not tell Diane, what he perhaps did not fully understand himself, was that the elixir he had created was not simply preserving her beauty, but fundamentally altering her relationship with life and death. The precious metals that were accumulating in her tissues were creating changes that went beyond cosmetic enhancement to encompass the basic processes that sustained human existence. She was becoming something that existed in the space between the living and the dead, maintained in a state of artificial perfection through daily communion with substances that would kill any ordinary person. As Diane prepared to face her first day as a woman transformed by alchemical arts, she felt a mixture of triumph and unease that she could not fully explain. She had achieved her goal of preserving the beauty that was essential for maintaining her power over Henri and her position as the unofficial Queen of France. But she had also crossed a threshold from which there could be no retreat, committing herself to a daily ritual that would either preserve her forever or destroy her in ways that no one could predict or prevent. The first golden kiss had been exchanged between mortal woman and immortal metal, sealing a pact that would make Diane de Poitiers the most beautiful woman in Europe while slowly transforming her into the most elaborate suicide in human history. She had chosen eternal beauty over natural life, artificial perfection over mortal limitation, and the promise of unchanging radiance over the ordinary progression of aging that claimed every other human being. But as she gazed into the mirror that would replace the one she had broken, admiring the supernatural perfection that the elixir had created, Diane could not shake the feeling that she was looking at a stranger, someone who wore her face, but who was no longer entirely the woman she had been before her first taste of liquid gold. The transformation was complete, but it was only the beginning of a journey that would lead her deeper into territories where beauty and death danced together in patterns that no mortal mind was meant to comprehend. Thus begins our tale of Renaissance vanity, taken to its ultimate extreme, where the pursuit of eternal beauty becomes a dance with death itself. In our next chapters, we shall explore the network of alchemists and physicians who enabled Diane's deadly transformation, the daily rituals that sustained her artificial beauty, and the growing madness that consumed her as the golden poison accumulated in her brain and organs. Rest well, dear listeners, but remember that the mirrors of history often reflect truths about human nature that are far more terrifying than any supernatural horror we could imagine. Chapter 4. Servants of Vanity. In the shadowed chambers beneath the Château d'Anay, where no natural light could penetrate and only the flickering glow of alchemical fires illuminated the work that transpired in service to vanity, more deadly than any sin catalogued by theologians, a conspiracy of learned men had gathered to perfect the art of transforming human flesh into something that defied every law of nature and mortality. These were not the crude charlatans who peddled beauty potions to gullible peasant women, but the most accomplished physicians, alchemists, and natural philosophers in Renaissance Europe, men whose knowledge of the human body and the hidden properties of matter had made them complicit in the most sophisticated form of murder ever devised. Picture Dr. Jean Fernel, the king's own physician, descending the stone steps that led to Nostradamus's underground laboratory on the morning of April 3rd, 1552, carrying with him detailed notes about the physiological changes he had observed in Diane de Poitiers during the 3 weeks since she'd begun consuming the golden elixir. Fernel was arguably the greatest medical mind of his generation, a man whose anatomical studies had advanced human understanding of the circulatory system, the nervous system, and the delicate balance of humours that sustained life in mortal flesh. But he was also a man whose scientific curiosity had overcome his moral qualms about participating in experiments that pushed the boundaries of medicine into realms that the Church would condemn as trafficking with diabolical forces. "The transformation exceeds my most optimistic predictions," Fernel reported as he joined Nostradamus and 3 other conspirators around a table laden with crucibles, retorts, and apparatus that would have been recognisable to any practitioner of the alchemical arts. Madame de Poitiers appears to have aged backward by at least 10 years, while acquiring a luminescence and vitality that I have never observed in any natural woman. But there are also changes occurring that concern me deeply. The other members of this clandestine council represented the apex of Renaissance learning, applied to purposes that would have horrified their contemporaries if the true nature of their work had become known. Paracelsus the Younger had inherited not only his father's name, but his revolutionary understanding of chemical medicine and his willingness to experiment with substances that conventional physicians considered too dangerous for human consumption. Giovanni Mercuriale brought expertise in toxicology and metallurgy gained through decades of studying the effects of various poisons on human physiology. Master Guillaume, the court's official alchemist, possessed practical knowledge of techniques for refining precious metals and creating preparations that could survive storage and transportation while maintaining their potency. Together, these 4 men had created what amounted to an invisible medical school dedicated to a single patient and a single objective, maintaining Diane de Poitiers' supernatural beauty through methods that required constant refinement, adjustment, and innovation as her body adapted to the daily consumption of substances that should have killed her within hours of first ingestion. "Describe the concerning changes," Nostradamus requested, as he made notes in a journal written in a cipher that combined Latin, Greek, and symbols derived from alchemical tradition. The secrecy was not mere affectation. If their activities were discovered by church authorities or rival physicians who might seek to destroy them through accusations of heresy or witchcraft, the coded records would be the only evidence of innovations that represented centuries of accumulated knowledge about the hidden properties of matter and the malleable nature of human flesh. Fernel consulted his own notes, written in the precise handwriting that characterized his approach to all aspects of medical practice. The patient experiences periods of disorientation that are becoming more frequent and more severe. Yesterday she failed to recognize servants who have attended her for years, and she spoke of events from her childhood as if they had occurred the previous day. Her hands tremble constantly now, though she attempts to conceal this through careful positioning and the use of gloves. Most concerning of all, I have detected changes in her pupils that suggest neurological damage consistent with mercury poisoning. The mercury that formed the foundation of Diane's daily elixir was essential for creating the luminous quality that made her skin appear to glow with its own inner light, but it was also one of the most neurotoxic substances known to Renaissance medicine. The physicians had understood from the beginning that prolonged mercury consumption would eventually cause brain damage, but they had hoped that the other components of the elixir would provide sufficient protection to prevent the most severe manifestations of metal poisoning. "We may need to reduce the mercury concentration," Paracelsus suggested, his voice carrying the authority of someone whose family name had become synonymous with revolutionary approaches to chemical medicine. The luminescence effect could perhaps be maintained through increased gold content, while substituting silver compounds for some of the mercury to preserve the transformative properties without accelerating neurological deterioration. But Master Guillaume shook his head, his expression reflecting the practical concerns of someone who understood the technical challenges involved in modifying alchemical preparations that had achieved perfect balance through months of careful experimentation. Any significant change to the formula risks destroying the stability that allows Madame de Poitiers to tolerate doses that would kill an ordinary person. We have achieved something unprecedented in medical history: the systematic preservation of human beauty through controlled poisoning. If we alter the fundamental composition now, we could trigger rejection reactions that would kill her within days. The dilemma they faced illustrated the terrible paradox that lay at the heart of their enterprise. The very substances that were preserving Diane's supernatural beauty were also slowly destroying her capacity for rational thought, physical coordination, and basic biological function. She was becoming more beautiful and less human with each passing day, transformed into something that existed in the space between life and death, art and nature, preservation and decay. Giovanni Mercuriale had been conducting his own research into the long-term effects of precious metal consumption on human physiology, using specimens obtained from executed criminals whose bodies had been made available for anatomical study. His findings provided disturbing insights into what was likely occurring within Diane's body at the cellular level, changes that were invisible to external observation, but which would ultimately determine whether their alchemical experiment would result in preserved beauty or elaborate death. Gold accumulates in the liver and kidneys, Mercurial reported, his voice carrying the clinical detachment that allowed physicians to discuss human suffering as if it were merely an interesting natural phenomenon. Over time, this accumulation interferes with the organ's ability to filter toxins from the blood, creating a cascading effect that compromises every system in the body. The patient may maintain the appearance of perfect health while dying slowly from internal organ failure. The implications of this research forced the conspirators to confront the possibility that their remarkable success in preserving Diane's beauty was actually an elaborate form of murder disguised as medical treatment. They had created a woman who appeared to grow younger and more radiant with each passing day, but who was simultaneously accumulating toxic metals in concentrations that would eventually prove fatal regardless of any adjustments they might make to her daily elixir. Yet none of them suggested discontinuing the treatments or warning Diane about the long-term consequences of her artificial transformation. They were all complicit in a form of medical experimentation that pushed the boundaries of Renaissance natural philosophy into territories that no ethical framework existed to govern or control. More importantly, they were all dependent on Diane's patronage and protection for their own survival in a world where accusations of heresy or witchcraft could result in imprisonment, torture, or execution. We must focus on managing the symptoms while maintaining the aesthetic effects, Nostradamus concluded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had made similar calculations countless times throughout his career, as an advisor to powerful figures who demanded results regardless of consequences. If we can delay the onset of organ failure for another 5 years, Madame de Poitiers will have achieved a form of immortality through beauty that exceeds anything accomplished by mortal woman. The method of her eventual death will be irrelevant compared to the legend she will have created. The cold calculation that characterized Nostradamus' approach to Diane's situation reflected broader attitudes about human experimentation that had emerged during the Renaissance as natural philosophers gained access to new knowledge about anatomy, chemistry, and the hidden properties of matter. The same intellectual curiosity that had produced revolutionary advances in art, literature, and science had also created opportunities for forms of exploitation that earlier generations would have considered unthinkable. Diane herself had become a living laboratory for testing theories about human enhancement that combined medical knowledge with alchemical speculation and what amounted to systematic torture disguised as beauty treatment. Every dose of her daily elixir represented a carefully controlled experiment in human toxicology, while every day of her continued survival provided data that advanced their understanding of how far the human body could be pushed beyond its natural limitations before collapse became inevitable. But the physicians were not simply dispassionate researchers pursuing knowledge for its own sake. They were also entrepreneurs who had discovered that the systematic destruction of human beings could be extraordinarily profitable when disguised as life enhancement and marketed to clients whose wealth and social position made them willing to pay any price for impossible promises. Consider the expanding network of clients who had begun requesting similar treatments after observing Diane's remarkable transformation. Word of her supernatural beauty had spread throughout European courts, carried by ambassadors, travelling nobles and merchants who had witnessed her impossible radiance firsthand. Within months, requests for alchemical beauty treatments had begun arriving from queens, princesses, and wealthy courtesans throughout the continent, each offering vast sums for access to the secrets that had made Diane de Poitiers the most beautiful woman in Europe. The physicians had responded by developing a range of alchemical preparations tailored to different clients' needs, financial resources, and tolerance for risk. Wealthy but cautious clients could purchase diluted versions of Diane's elixir that would produce modest improvements in appearance while minimizing the risk of immediate death. More ambitious patrons could opt for stronger formulations that promised more dramatic results, but which carried correspondingly higher risks of organ failure, neurological damage, or sudden collapse. Most lucrative of all were the clients who requested the full treatment that Diane herself received, complete transformation through systematic poisoning that would preserve their beauty indefinitely, while slowly destroying every system in their bodies. These clients paid premium prices for the privilege of committing suicide in the most luxurious and sophisticated manner ever devised, while providing the physicians with opportunities to refine their techniques through human experimentation on an unprecedented scale. The moral implications of this expanding business enterprise were never discussed explicitly among the conspirators, but they were understood by all participants. They had discovered methods for transforming human vanity into extraordinary profits while advancing their understanding of human physiology through procedures that amounted to systematic torture. They were simultaneously healers and killers, scientists and merchants, preservers of beauty and architects of death. The laboratory beneath the Château d'Annay had become the nerve centre for a criminal conspiracy that extended throughout European high society, connecting physicians, alchemists, and clients in relationships that combined medical treatment with business partnership and what amounted to murder for hire. The apparatus they had assembled for creating Diane's daily elixir was also being used to produce similar preparations for dozens of other clients, while the knowledge they gained from observing her gradual deterioration was being applied to refining treatments that would kill other victims more efficiently or more slowly depending on the specific requirements of individual cases. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of their enterprise involved the recruitment of assistants and apprentices who were being trained in techniques that combined legitimate medical knowledge with systematic methods for human destruction. Young physicians and alchemists throughout Europe were learning to create preparations that could preserve beauty through controlled poisoning, while developing the psychological detachment necessary to observe human suffering as merely another form of natural phenomenon worthy of clinical study. The servants of vanity had created an industry based on the systematic exploitation of human weakness, transforming the natural desire for beauty and youth into opportunities for profit that exceeded anything available through conventional medical practice. They had also created a form of knowledge that would survive long after their individual deaths, preserved in coded journals and passed down through apprenticeship relationships that would influence approaches to human enhancement for generations to come. As Dr. Fernel prepared to return to his official duties as the king's physician, he carried with him not just medical observations about Diane's condition, but awareness of his participation in enterprises that challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between healing and harm, preservation and destruction, beauty and death. He was complicit in creating a woman whose supernatural radiance was purchased through daily communion with forces that operated beyond the boundaries of natural philosophy or Christian theology. The conspiracy would continue, the experiments would proceed, and the profits would accumulate. But the servants of vanity had also created something that none of them fully understood or controlled, a form of artificial life that existed in the space between preservation and decay, sustained through daily contact with substances that would eventually claim its creator, while leaving behind innovations that would influence human understanding of beauty, mortality, and the terrible prices that could be paid for impossible dreams. The Chapter 5, The Golden Ritual, the ceremony that sustained Diane de Poitiers' supernatural beauty, was not the casual consumption of medicine that one might expect from conventional medical treatment, but an elaborate daily ritual that combined alchemical precision with religious devotion and theatrical performance to create an experience that transformed the simple act of swallowing poison into something resembling communion with divine forces. Every morning at precisely dawn, in chambers that had been consecrated according to principles that blended Christian symbolism with pagan practices older than recorded history, Diane participated in ceremonies that would have shocked her contemporaries with their blasphemous parody of sacred rites and their systematic inversion of everything that Renaissance Christianity taught about the proper relationship between human souls and eternal salvation. Picture the scene in Diane's private oratory on the morning of June 21st, 1553, the summer solstice, when the powers that governed her artificial transformation were said to reach their annual peak of potency and effectiveness. The chamber has been prepared according to specifications that Nostradamus developed through years of studying the hidden correspondences between celestial movements, alchemical processes, and the subtle energies that flowed through human flesh when properly aligned with cosmic forces that operated beyond the understanding of conventional natural philosophy. The walls are draped with cloth of gold that has been woven according to patterns derived from ancient Egyptian texts about the preservation of human beauty beyond the boundaries of mortal existence. Candles made from beeswax mixed with powdered pearls and crushed gems cast light that creates an otherworldly atmosphere, while incense burning in golden censers fills the air with vapours that contain trace amounts of the same substances that Diane will soon consume in more concentrated form. At the centre of the chamber stands an altar that would be recognisable to any student of alchemical tradition, but which has been modified to serve the specific requirements of Diane's daily transformation. The surface is covered with silk that has been dyed with gold leaf dissolved in mercury, creating a fabric that seems to shimmer with its own inner fire. Upon this supernatural textile rest the implements that will be used in the morning's ritual: crystal vessels that contain the various components of Diane's elixir, silver tools for measuring and mixing the precise quantities required for her daily dose, and the golden chalice that will serve as the final vessel for her communion with forces that exist beyond the boundaries of life and death. But the most remarkable aspect of the ritual chamber is the presence of relics that connect Diane's alchemical practices with religious traditions that stretch back to the earliest days of Christian mysticism. A fragment of the true cross, authenticated by papal authority and purchased at enormous cost, has been ground to powder and incorporated into the morning elixir to sanctify the otherwise blasphemous consumption of substances that the Church would condemn as demonic in origin. Water from the River Jordan, blessed by the Patriarch of Jerusalem, is used to dilute the mercury that forms the foundation of her daily dose. Most remarkably of all, a vial of oil taken from the lamp that burns perpetually over the tomb of St. Mary Magdalene is added to each morning's preparation to invoke the protection of the patron saint of penitent women. These religious elements serve both practical and psychological functions in Diane's daily ritual. On a practical level, they provide a framework that allows her to interpret her systematic self-poisoning as a form of religious devotion rather than elaborate suicide, creating mental structures that help her maintain the psychological stability necessary for continuing treatments that would otherwise be recognized as obviously destructive to human health and spiritual welfare. On a psychological level, the religious elements help Diane cope with the growing awareness that her artificial beauty is being purchased through methods that place her soul in jeopardy, according to every theological framework that governs Christian understanding of proper relationships between human beings and divine authority. By incorporating blessed objects and sacred substances into her alchemical practices, she can convince herself that she is participating in a form of mystical experience rather than simply consuming poison for vanity's sake. The ritual itself begins at the moment when the first rays of sunlight penetrate the chamber through windows that have been positioned to capture the dawn light at precisely the angle required for optimal alchemical effectiveness. Diane kneels before the altar in a posture that combines religious devotion with the practical requirements of alchemical procedure, her hands folded in prayer while her eyes focus on the golden chalice that contains her daily communion with immortality. "Grant me, O Lord, the grace to preserve the beauty with which you have blessed me," she recites, speaking words that Nostradamus has composed specifically for her morning devotions, "that I may continue to serve your glory through the power you have granted me over the hearts and minds of mortal men." The prayer combines genuine religious sentiment with rationalization that allows her to interpret her pursuit of artificial beauty as a form of service to divine purposes rather than simple vanity that places her soul at risk. The preparation of the morning elixir follows procedures that combine pharmaceutical precision with ritual practices that have been derived from sources that predate Christian influence in European culture. Each component must be added in exact sequence, with specific prayers recited during the mixing process and particular attention paid to the astrological conditions that govern the effectiveness of different substances when consumed by human beings whose constitutions have been altered through prolonged exposure to alchemical preparations. The gold that forms the primary component of each dose is not ordinary metal but aurum potabile, drinkable gold that has been prepared through processes that dissolve the metal at the molecular level while preserving its essential properties of permanence and incorruptibility. The creation of aurum potabile requires techniques that combine conventional metallurgy with procedures that border on what medieval theologians would have classified as miracles, involving the transformation of solid matter into liquid form through processes that seem to violate fundamental laws about the conservation of substance and the immutable nature of elemental composition. The mercury that provides the second major component has been prepared through equally elaborate procedures that purify the metal of impurities while enhancing its ability to penetrate human tissue and create the luminous effects that give Diane's skin its supernatural glow. This mercury vivum has been exposed to moonlight for exactly 28 nights, heated and cooled according to cycles that correspond to lunar phases, and blessed with holy water that has been consecrated specifically for use in alchemical procedures that serve Christian purposes. But the most dangerous component of Diane's daily elixir is the antimony that provides the neurological stimulation responsible for her enhanced charisma and sexual magnetism. Antimony in its natural form is deadly to human consumption in any quantity, but the alchemical preparation that Diane consumes has been processed through techniques that reduce its immediate toxicity while concentrating its psychoactive properties. The result is a substance that enhances cognitive function and emotional responsiveness in the short term while causing cumulative neurological damage that will eventually prove fatal. The mixing of these components requires not just technical precision, but spiritual preparation that aligns Diane's consciousness with forces that govern the transformation of base matter into substances capable of preserving human beauty beyond the normal limitations of mortal existence. Each ingredient must be added while she recites specific prayers, performs prescribed gestures, and maintains mental focus on the desired outcomes of her alchemical communion. The final step in the preparation involves the blessing of the completed elixir through procedures that invoke both Christian and pre-Christian sources of spiritual authority. Holy water is sprinkled over the golden chalice, while Diane recites passages from the Song of Solomon that celebrate physical beauty as a reflection of divine creativity. Incense is burned to carry her prayers to heaven, while simultaneously creating atmospheric conditions that enhance the psychological impact of consuming substances that will alter her consciousness as well as her physical appearance. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the daily ritual involves the gradual transformation that occurs in Diane's own perception of what she's doing. What began as desperate measures to preserve her political power through maintained beauty has evolved into something that she experiences as genuine religious devotion, a daily communion with forces that she believes have chosen her to serve as their earthly representative. "I am becoming something more than mortal woman," she confides to her private journal on this summer solstice morning, her handwriting showing the slight tremor that has become more pronounced as the neurological effects of her treatments accumulate. "Each day I feel myself growing closer to the divine essence that governs all beauty, all love, all power over the hearts of men. The elixir is not poison, but grace made manifest in material form." This psychological transformation allows Diane to continue treatments that any rational person would recognize as systematic suicide, but it also creates spiritual and emotional dependencies that extend far beyond the physical addiction that her body has developed to the daily consumption of toxic metals. She has become psychologically dependent on the sense of transcendence that accompanies each morning's ritual, the feeling of participating in cosmic processes that elevate her above the ordinary limitations that constrain mortal women. The consumption of the elixir itself has evolved into a ceremonial act that combines the practical requirements of medicine with the spiritual dimensions of religious sacrament. Diane raises the golden chalice with both hands, holding it above her head while she recites final prayers that acknowledge the risks she is accepting in exchange for the supernatural beauty that defines her identity and provides the foundation for her power over Henri and the French court. "I accept whatever fate awaits me," she declares as she brings the chalice to her lips. "In gratitude for the gifts you have bestowed upon me, and in service to the purposes you have revealed through my transformation." The words carry conviction that suggests genuine religious faith, but they also serve as rationalization for behavior that places her in mortal danger for the sake of preserving advantages that could be lost through natural aging. The immediate effects of each morning's dose have become familiar through months of daily repetition, but they retain their power to convince Diane that she is participating in genuinely supernatural processes, rather than simply poisoning herself in sophisticated ways. Within minutes of consumption, her skin begins to glow with the luminescence that makes her appear to be lit from within by some source of light that exists beyond normal physical processes. Her eyes acquire a brilliance that makes them appear to contain depths that exceed normal human consciousness, while her hair gains luster and flexibility that defies every natural law governing the effects of aging on human appearance. But the psychological effects of the daily ritual may be even more significant than the physical transformation it produces. The elaborate ceremonial framework that surrounds her consumption of toxic substances creates a sense of participating in sacred mysteries that elevates her daily act of self-destruction into something that feels like spiritual achievement rather than gradual suicide. The religious elements that have been incorporated into her alchemical practices allow her to interpret the neurological damage caused by mercury poisoning as evidence of mystical experiences that bring her closer to divine consciousness. The confusion and disorientation that result from antimony consumption become signs of expanded awareness that transcends ordinary human limitations. The organ damage caused by gold accumulation is transformed into evidence of physical purification that prepares her for eventual translation into purely spiritual existence. These reinterpretations of obviously destructive symptoms allow Diane to continue treatments that would otherwise be recognized as obviously fatal, but they also create psychological structures that make it increasingly difficult for her to distinguish between spiritual experience and the effects of systematic poisoning on her brain chemistry. She's becoming not just physically dependent on her daily elixir, but psychologically convinced that her gradual death represents a form of apotheosis that will elevate her beyond the ordinary boundaries of human existence. As the summer solstice ritual concludes, and Diane prepares to face another day of wielding impossible beauty as a weapon against the natural order of time and mortality, she carries within her body concentrations of toxic metals that would kill any ordinary person within hours. But she also carries absolute conviction that her daily communion with these deadly substances represents participation in divine processes that have chosen her to serve as their earthly instrument. The golden ritual has become the organizing principle of her existence, the daily ceremony that transforms systematic self-destruction into spiritual practice and converts the gradual dissolution of her humanity into evidence of transcendence that exceeds the understanding of ordinary mortals. She has created a form of religious experience based on the worship of her own artificial beauty, sustained through daily communion with substances that promise eternal radiance while delivering inevitable death. But as long as the ritual continues to produce the supernatural effects that maintain her power over Henri and her position as the unofficial Queen of France, Diane will continue to kneel before her alchemical altar each morning, consuming liquid gold with the devotion of a martyr and the conviction of someone who believes that her elaborate suicide represents the highest form of service to forces that govern beauty, love, and power throughout the mortal world. Chapter 6. Mirror of Madness. The looking glass that replaced the shattered mirror in Diane de Poitiers' chambers was not merely a piece of furniture, but a portal to a realm where reality bent to accommodate truths too terrible for the human mind to process, without fragmenting under the weight of their implications. Crafted by Venetian artisans who specialized in creating surfaces that could reveal more than conventional reflection, this mirror had been embedded with threads of silver that had been alchemically treated to respond to the spiritual emanations of whoever gazed into its depths, creating reflections that showed not just physical appearance, but the hidden dimensions of identity that existed beneath the surface of mortal flesh. Picture Diane standing before this supernatural mirror on the morning of September 13th, 1554, 2 years and 6 months after she had begun her daily consumption of liquid gold, watching as her reflection displayed a face that defied every law of nature and mortality, while simultaneously revealing changes that filled her with a horror she could not name or acknowledge without destroying the psychological frameworks that had allowed her to continue her alchemical transformation. The woman in the mirror appeared to be no more than 25 years old, possessed of skin that seemed to glow with its own inner light, and features that had achieved a perfection that exceeded anything she had possessed during her natural youth. Her hair gleamed like spun gold, thick and lustrous, without a single thread of silver to suggest that she had lived for more than 5 decades of plague, war, and political upheaval. Her figure retained the slender grace of a maiden, curved in all the right places but without the matronly heaviness that typically accompanied middle age, in an era when most women bore child after child, until their bodies surrendered to exhaustion and premature aging. But the mirror also revealed details that mortal eyes could not perceive without supernatural assistance. Subtle signs that the daily consumption of precious metals was creating changes that extended far beyond cosmetic enhancement into realms that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of human existence. Her skin, while luminous and seemingly perfect, had acquired a waxy quality that suggested preservation rather than natural health. Her eyes, while brilliant and mesmerizing, reflected light in patterns that indicated cellular changes that had never been observed in living human tissue. Most disturbing of all, the mirror revealed that Diane's reflection occasionally moved independently of her physical actions, performing gestures and displaying expressions that she herself was not making. These autonomous movements lasted only seconds and occurred so subtly that ordinary observers would dismiss them as tricks of light or momentary inattention, but they suggested that her alchemical transformation was creating changes in her fundamental relationship with physical reality that extended beyond anything that Renaissance natural philosophy could explain or understand. "What am I becoming?" Diane whispered to her reflection, her voice carrying uncertainty that would have shocked courtiers who knew her only as the supremely confident woman whose beauty had captured a king's heart and whose political acumen had made her the unofficial ruler of France. But in the privacy of her chambers, confronted with evidence that her artificial preservation was producing changes that transcended conventional understanding of human biology, she could not suppress growing awareness that her daily ritual was transforming her into something that existed in the space between life and death. The psychological impact of observing these supernatural changes had been accumulating over months of daily confrontations with evidence that her alchemical transformation was proceeding according to principles that no earthly science could fully comprehend. Each morning's reflection showed her a face that grew more beautiful and more alien, more perfect and more obviously artificial, more desirable and more obviously divorced from anything that could be classified as natural human existence. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of her relationship with the mirror involved the gradual realization that she was becoming dependent not just on the physical effects of her daily elixir, but on the psychological validation that came from seeing her supernatural beauty confirmed in the silver surface that had become the arbiter of her self-worth and the measure of her continued viability as Henri's mistress and France's unofficial queen. The mirror had become a drug as addictive as the alchemical substances she consumed each morning, providing the daily reassurance that her elaborate suicide was producing results that justified the risks she was accepting and the prices she was paying. Without the confirmation provided by her reflection, she might have been forced to acknowledge that the neurological symptoms, physical tremors, and cognitive disruptions that she experienced were evidence of systematic poisoning rather than signs of spiritual transformation. Consider the changes that had occurred in Diane's daily routine as her relationship with the mirror evolved from simple vanity into obsessive dependency that structured every aspect of her existence around the need for constant visual confirmation of her artificial beauty. She now spent hours each morning examining her reflection from every possible angle, searching for signs of aging or deterioration that might indicate that her alchemical treatments were losing their effectiveness or that adjustments to her daily elixir might be required. These sessions had become ritualistic in their precision and compulsive in their intensity, involving not just casual observation, but systematic cataloguing of every detail of her appearance with the thoroughness of a natural philosopher documenting experimental results. She measured the luminosity of her skin using calibrated candles that allowed precise comparison between different days and different seasons. She recorded the exact shade and intensity of her hair color using samples of gold thread that provided standard references for determining whether her artificial radiance was maintaining consistent levels. Most obsessively, she documented every aspect of her facial features using techniques that combined artistic observation with mathematical precision, creating detailed records that would allow her to detect changes so subtle that they would escape notice from casual observers, but which might indicate that her preservation was beginning to fail in ways that could threaten her position as Henri's beloved and France's shadow queen. But the mirror also revealed changes that Diane's conscious mind refused to acknowledge, alterations in her appearance that suggested her alchemical transformation was proceeding in directions that no one had anticipated and that might prove impossible to control or reverse. Her reflection occasionally displayed features that seemed to shift and flow like liquid metal, creating momentary impressions that her face was not entirely solid, but was instead composed of materials that could be reshaped according to principles that operated beyond the normal laws governing physical matter. These disturbing observations forced Diane to develop increasingly elaborate psychological defenses that allowed her to continue her daily rituals without confronting evidence that her artificial beauty was being purchased at costs that extended beyond simple physical health into realms that challenged her fundamental understanding of personal identity and spiritual welfare. She began to interpret the strange movements and alterations in her reflection as evidence of divine intervention that was enhancing her transformation beyond anything that purely alchemical processes could achieve. The moments when her mirror image seemed to act independently became signs of mystical experiences that connected her with forces that governed beauty and love throughout the celestial hierarchy. Most remarkably, she developed the ability to selectively ignore aspects of her reflection that contradicted her preferred interpretation of what was occurring during her alchemical transformation. The waxy quality of her skin became evidence of purification that was preparing her for eventual translation into purely spiritual existence. The alien qualities in her eyes were transformed into signs of expanded consciousness that allowed her to perceive realities that remained hidden from ordinary mortal awareness. These psychological adaptations allowed Diane to continue treatments that would otherwise have been recognized as obviously destructive to human health and spiritual welfare, but they also created forms of mental instability that affected her behavior in ways that courtiers began to notice, despite her efforts to maintain the appearance of normal psychological function. Her conversations increasingly focused on topics that suggested detachment from ordinary reality and growing preoccupation with mystical experiences that she claimed to undergo during her daily alchemical rituals. She spoke of receiving visions that revealed her destiny as an earthly representative of divine forces that governed beauty and love throughout the created universe. She described communications with spiritual entities that provided guidance about political decisions and personal choices that affected not just her own welfare but the future of France itself. Most disturbing to those who observed her closely, Diane began to display knowledge of events and information that she could not have acquired through normal means, suggesting that her alchemical transformation was creating changes in her consciousness that allowed access to sources of information that existed beyond the boundaries of ordinary human awareness. King Henri, whose psychological dependency on Diane's supernatural beauty had become as complete as her physical addiction to the substances that preserved it, interpreted these changes as evidence that his beloved mistress was developing abilities that confirmed her status as a being who existed above the normal limitations that constrained mortal women. Rather than recognizing her growing detachment from reality as symptoms of neurological damage caused by systematic metal poisoning, he celebrated her mystical experiences as proof that their love had been blessed by divine forces that intended them to rule France according to principles that transcended ordinary political authority. "She speaks with angels," Henri confided to his private secretary, his voice carrying the awe of someone who believed he was witnessing genuine miracles rather than the effects of brain damage on human consciousness. "The visions she receives guide our policies with wisdom that exceeds anything that mortal counselors could provide. Through her transformation, God has granted France access to knowledge that will ensure our triumph over all enemies and our prosperity throughout generations to come." This interpretation of Diane's psychological deterioration as evidence of spiritual elevation created feedback loops that reinforced her own growing disconnection from reality, while providing Henri with rationalizations for political decisions that were increasingly influenced by the hallucinations and delusions that resulted from her daily consumption of neurotoxic substances. The mirror that had been intended to preserve Diane's vanity had become an instrument for documenting her gradual transformation from a beautiful woman into something that existed in the spaces between human and divine, natural and artificial, living and dead. Each morning's reflection showed her a face that was more perfect and more obviously unnatural, more desirable and more clearly divorced from anything that could be sustained through normal biological processes. But the mirror also served as the focal point for psychological processes that allowed Diane to continue her elaborate suicide without acknowledging the true nature of what she was doing to herself. By creating interpretive frameworks that transformed obvious symptoms of poisoning into evidence of spiritual transformation, she had developed the mental flexibility necessary to pursue impossible beauty through methods that would kill any ordinary person, while convincing herself that she was participating in divine processes rather than simply committing murder against her own body and soul. As autumn shadows lengthened across her chambers on this September morning in 1554, Diane gazed into her supernatural mirror and saw reflected there not just her own face but the face of human vanity taken to its ultimate extreme. Beauty preserved through systematic destruction of everything that made preservation worthwhile. Perfection achieved through processes that transformed the achiever into something that could no longer appreciate or benefit from the perfection it had gained. The mirror of madness continued to reflect impossible beauty, while documenting the gradual dissolution of the humanity that had once been capable of experiencing beauty as more than simply another form of power to be wielded in the endless competition for political advantage and personal survival. Diane de Poitiers was becoming immortal through daily death, eternal through systematic decay, perfect through the methodical destruction of everything that had once made her imperfection beautiful. Thus we witness the psychological dimensions of Diane's alchemical transformation, where the preservation of beauty becomes indistinguishable from the destruction of sanity, and where mirrors reveal truths that their observers lack the courage to acknowledge or understand. In our next chapters, we shall explore how Diane's deadly obsession spread throughout the French court like a contagion, how her rival queen Catherine de Medici plotted to use this knowledge against her, and how the network of physicians and alchemists who served her vanity began to accumulate their own body count as the demand for impossible beauty created markets for systematic murder disguised as medical treatment. Rest well, dear listeners, but remember that the mirrors we create often reflect not just our appearance, but our souls, and sometimes what we see there is too terrible to acknowledge without losing the very sanity that allows us to continue looking. Chapter 7. The Court of Shadows. The year 1547 brought whispers that slithered through the corridors of Fontainebleau like serpents seeking warm flesh. Diane de Poitiers had become something more than mortal, something that existed in the spaces between life and death, sustained by substances that should have killed her years ago. At 48, she appeared frozen at 25, her skin luminous with an otherworldly pallor that made courtiers cross themselves when they thought she wasn't looking. The new king, Henri II, had ascended the throne with the fervour of a man possessed. His obsession with Diane had deepened beyond reason, beyond sanity. He would spend hours simply watching her move through the palace, studying the way light seemed to bend around her form, how shadows fled from her presence, as if afraid of what they might reveal. The court physicians whispered of unnatural preservation, of flesh that refused to yield to time's relentless march. "She does not age," muttered Dr. Jean Fernel, the king's personal physician, to his assistant as they observed Diane from across the grand ballroom. "It has been 10 years since I first examined her, and not a single line has appeared upon her face. Her hair maintains its lustrous darkness, her eyes their impossible clarity. This is not the work of God." The assistant, a young man named Claude, who had recently arrived from the University of Paris, studied Diane with the intensity of a scholar examining a rare manuscript. Perhaps she has discovered some alchemical secret, some elixir of youth that the ancients spoke of. Fernel shook his head slowly, his weathered face creased with worry. "No elixir grants such preservation without demanding a price. Look closer, Claude. Observe how she moves, how she breathes. There is something hollow about her, as if she exists in a state between worlds. Indeed, Those who watched Diane carefully began to notice peculiarities that defied natural explanation. She never seemed to perspire, even in the stifling heat of summer ceremonies. Her breath carried no warmth, creating no mist in the cold morning air of winter hunts. Her fingernails had taken on a strange metallic sheen that caught torchlight and reflected it in ways that made observers uncomfortable. The servants who attended her private chambers spoke in hushed tones of the rituals they witnessed. Each morning, before dawn painted the sky, Diane would stand naked before a mirror made of polished silver that had been crafted by Moorish artisans centuries ago. The glass seemed to ripple like water when she gazed into it, showing not just her reflection but something deeper, something that moved independently of her physical form. "I have seen her shadow behave strangely," whispered Marie, one of her longest-serving ladies-in-waiting. "Sometimes it lingers when she moves, as if reluctant to follow. Other times, I swear it moves before she does, leading rather than following. And the colour, shadows should be dark, but hers seems to shimmer with gold." The morning rituals had evolved into elaborate ceremonies that consumed hours of Diane's day. She would begin by consuming a mixture that had grown increasingly complex over the years. The base remained liquid gold, dissolved in aqua regia until it flowed like honey, but now it was enhanced with mercury that had been distilled 7 times under specific lunar phases. Antimony ground from ore mined in the mountains of Bohemia, and substances so rare that their names were known only to the most secretive alchemists. Her physician, Dr. Paracelsus himself, during his rare visits to court, had warned her of the dangers. "Madame, the human form was not designed to contain such elements. Gold may preserve, but mercury destroys. The combination creates a tension within your very essence that cannot be maintained indefinitely." But Diane had moved beyond the reach of conventional wisdom. She existed now in a realm where normal rules held no sway, where the boundary between life and death had become permeable. Her beauty had transcended the merely physical, becoming something supernatural that drew observers into a state of fascination bordering on madness. King Henry's devotion had deepened into something that terrified even his closest advisors. He would speak to her portrait when she was absent, carrying on conversations with the painted image as if it possessed its own consciousness. He had commissioned no fewer than 12 artists to capture her likeness, but each painting seemed to show something slightly different, as if her essence refused to be contained within static representation. "The king speaks of making her immortal," confided Cardinal de Lorraine to the Venetian ambassador during a private dinner. "He has consulted with alchemists, with scholars of the occult, seeking ways to preserve her forever. I fear he would damn his own soul to ensure her eternal beauty." The court itself had begun to change in response to Diane's presence. Colours seemed more vivid in her vicinity. Music sounded richer and more haunting. Even the architecture appeared to shift subtly when she passed through rooms, as if the very stones yearned to accommodate her otherworldly essence. Tapestries would seem to move without any breeze, their woven figures appearing to turn their heads to follow her passage. Diane herself had grown increasingly detached from the world around her. She spoke less frequently, and when she did, her voice carried an odd resonance that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her physical form. Her laughter, once warm and engaging, now held notes that made listeners shiver despite themselves. She moved through the court like a figure from a dream, present but not entirely connected to the reality others inhabited. The transformation was most apparent in her eyes. Once a clear, intelligent brown, they now held depths that seemed to extend far beyond what should be physically possible. Those who met her gaze reported feeling as if they were looking into an abyss, into spaces that existed outside normal perception. Some claimed they could see stars reflected in her pupils, constellations that matched no earthly sky. Her relationship with mirrors had become almost mystical. She would spend hours gazing into various reflective surfaces throughout the palace, each seeming to show her something different. The silver mirror in her chambers revealed her preserved beauty, but the bronze mirror in the library showed shadows of future decay. The polished steel mirror in the armory reflected not her face, but landscapes of impossible beauty, realms that existed nowhere in the physical world. As autumn approached, bringing with it the scent of dying leaves and the promise of winter's embrace, strange phenomena began to manifest around Diane with increasing frequency. Flowers would bloom out of season in her presence, their petals taking on metallic hues that matched the strange sheen of her fingernails. Animals would approach her without fear, but their behaviour would become erratic afterward, as if they had been touched by something that existed beyond their understanding. The nights grew longer, and with them came dreams that plagued the entire court. Courtiers reported visions of golden rivers flowing through darkened landscapes, of mirrors that reflected worlds where time moved differently, of a woman whose beauty had become so perfect that it threatened to tear holes in the fabric of reality itself. These dreams were so vivid, so consistent among different dreamers, that many began to believe they were not dreams at all, but glimpses into a realm where Diane's true essence resided. Chapter 8. The Golden Plague. By the winter of 1548, the transformation of Diane de Poitiers had begun to affect not just herself, but the very fabric of the French court. What had once been whispered concerns among physicians and servants had evolved into something approaching mass hysteria, though none dared speak openly of their fears. The king's obsession had created an atmosphere where questioning Diane's condition was tantamount to treason, yet the evidence of something profoundly unnatural could no longer be ignored. The physical changes in Diane had accelerated dramatically. Her skin now possessed a luminescence that was visible even in daylight, a subtle glow that seemed to emanate from within her very bones. Court painters complained that no pigment could capture this radiance, that their brushes seemed to rebel against depicting what they saw. One artist, driven to madness by his attempts to paint her portrait, was found in his studio covered in gold leaf, claiming that only by becoming gold himself could he hope to capture her essence. Dr. Jean Fernel had begun keeping detailed records of the phenomena surrounding Diane, creating what would later be called the most comprehensive documentation of supernatural transformation in Renaissance history. His journal, written in Latin to prevent servants from understanding its contents, described changes that defied every principle of medicine and natural philosophy. The subject's pulse has become irregular in ways that should not permit continued consciousness, he wrote. At times, her heart seems to cease beating entirely for periods of up to 30 seconds, yet she shows no distress, no alteration in complexion or demeanour. Her body temperature fluctuates wildly, sometimes dropping to levels that should induce death, other times rising to heights that would normally cause delirium. Most disturbing of all, her blood, when drawn for examination, has taken on a golden hue and seems to move with a life of its own, forming patterns in the collection vessel that resemble written script in languages I cannot identify. The morning rituals in Diane's chambers had evolved into elaborate ceremonies that now required the participation of multiple attendants. The consumption of her alchemical mixture had become a process that took nearly 2 hours to complete, involving precise timing, specific incantations, and the use of instruments crafted from materials that had to be acquired through increasingly shadowy networks of occult practitioners. Her primary alchemist, a mysterious figure known only as Magister Aurelius, had become a permanent resident of the palace, occupying a tower room that had been specially constructed for his work. The room itself seemed to exist in a state of constant twilight, its windows showing not the actual sky, but visions of celestial phenomena that occurred nowhere in the natural world. The sounds that emerged from this laboratory were unlike anything heard in normal alchemical practice. Whispers in unknown languages, the chiming of bells that cast no shadows, and a constant low humming that seemed to resonate in the bones of anyone who approached. The effects of Diane's transformation had begun to manifest in those around her. Members of her immediate household reported changes in their own appearance and behaviour. Lady Catherine, her closest companion, found that her hair had begun to take on a golden tint that no dye could explain. 2 of her ladies-in-waiting developed an aversion to sunlight so severe that they could no longer leave the palace during daylight hours. Most disturbing of all, several servants reported that their reflections in mirrors had begun to lag behind their movements, sometimes by several seconds. King Henri's obsession had crossed the boundary from passionate devotion into something that resembled religious mania. He had commissioned the construction of a private chapel within the palace, where he would pray not to God but to Diane, believing that her transformation had elevated her to a status approaching divinity. The chapel itself defied conventional architecture, its proportions creating optical illusions that made observers feel dizzy and disoriented. The altar was constructed entirely of gold, and upon it stood not a crucifix but a life-size statue of Diane that seemed to breathe when viewed from certain angles. "The king has ceased to rule France," observed the Spanish ambassador in a coded letter to Madrid. "He rules now only in service to this woman who has become something beyond mortal understanding. Court functions have been restructured around her needs, diplomatic meetings postponed if they conflict with her rituals, military decisions delayed until her mirrors have been consulted for favourable omens. We are witnessing the transformation of a kingdom into something that serves purposes no earthly power can comprehend." The mirrors throughout the palace had become focal points for increasingly disturbing phenomena. Courtiers reported seeing their own deaths reflected in the polished surfaces, glimpses of future events that would later prove accurate, and visions of places that existed in no earthly geography. The great mirror in the throne room now showed not the reflection of whoever stood before it, but images of Diane regardless of whether she was present, as if her essence had become permanently embedded in every reflective surface within the palace walls. Children were particularly affected by Diane's presence, often crying uncontrollably when she approached, or, conversely, following her with expressions of vacant adoration that frightened their parents. Several young nobles reported dreams in which Diane appeared to them bathed in golden light, speaking in languages they didn't understand but somehow comprehended, offering them gifts that they were afraid to accept even in their sleeping minds. The physical structure of the palace itself seemed to be responding to Diane's transformation. Corridors appeared longer than they had been previously mapped. Rooms contained shadows that fell in directions inconsistent with light sources, and the very walls seemed to pulse with a rhythm that matched no earthly heartbeat. Temperature fluctuations occurred without apparent cause, creating microclimates within individual rooms that defied explanation. Dr. Paracelsus, during his final visit to the court, had attempted to examine Diane directly. The session lasted only minutes before he fled her presence, his face pale with terror. Later, when pressed by Fennell for details, he would only say, "She is no longer entirely present in this world. What we see is but the shadow of something that exists primarily in realms beyond our understanding. The woman we knew as Diane de Poitiers has become a doorway, a conduit through which forces beyond human comprehension are bleeding into our reality. The consumption of gold had reached levels that should have killed her dozens of times over. Conservative estimates suggested she was ingesting nearly an ounce of gold daily, along with quantities of mercury and antimony that would be lethal to any normal human within hours. Yet rather than showing signs of poisoning, she seemed to grow stronger, more radiant, more terrifyingly beautiful with each passing day. Her hair, now possessed of a luster that seemed to generate its own light, had grown to unprecedented length and would move without any breeze, sometimes coiling and uncoiling like living serpents. Her fingernails had become translucent, revealing veins of actual gold running through their structure. Most unsettling of all, her eyes now reflected light in ways that suggested they were no longer composed entirely of organic matter. The winter months brought with them phenomena that challenged the sanity of everyone in the palace. Aurora-like lights would appear in the skies above the castle on clear nights, displaying colours that had no names in any human language. The library's books began rearranging themselves, ancient texts moving to positions where they would be easily accessible to Diane during her nocturnal wanderings. Musical instruments would play themselves when she passed by, creating melodies that existed in no earthly musical tradition. By December, even the most skeptical courtiers could no longer deny that something supernatural was occurring. The question was no longer whether Diane had transcended normal human limitations, but whether her transformation represented divine intervention or something far more sinister. The answer, they would soon discover, lay in understanding the true nature of the forces she had unleashed through her relentless pursuit of impossible beauty. Chapter 9. The Mercurial Madness. The year 1549 brought winter's deepest bite to the French court, but within the walls of Fontainebleau, temperature had become a matter of will rather than weather. Diane de Poitiers now existed in a perpetual state of transformation that defied every natural law, her body serving as a battleground between life and death, between human flesh and something far more otherworldly. The mercury that flowed through her veins had begun to assert its own terrible intelligence, creating changes that went beyond the merely physical into realms that challenged the very concept of individual identity. Dr. Jean Fernel's journals from this period read like the fevered dreams of a madman, yet they represented the most methodical documentation available of phenomena that existed beyond the boundaries of accepted science. His handwriting, once precise and scholarly, had become erratic, the letters sometimes forming themselves into shapes that resembled alchemical symbols rather than conventional text. This was not due to any decline in his mental faculties, but rather because prolonged exposure to Diane's transformed presence had begun to affect the neural pathways of everyone in her immediate vicinity. "The mercury has achieved consciousness," Fennell wrote in his most disturbing entry. "I can observe its movement beneath her skin, silver streams that pulse and flow with purposeful intent. When she speaks, I can see the liquid metal gathering at the base of her throat, as if it were contributing to the formation of her words. Her voice now carries harmonics that exist outside normal auditory ranges, frequencies that seem to resonate directly with the metallic elements in observers' own bodies. Several courtiers have reported feeling their teeth ache when she sings, and I myself have experienced a strange tingling in my fingertips that corresponds precisely with her patterns of speech." The morning rituals had evolved into something that resembled a religious ceremony, conducted by practitioners of a faith that served no earthly deity. Diane would rise before dawn and position herself before the great silver mirror that had been moved to the centre of her chamber. The mirror itself had undergone its own transformation, its surface now rippling like liquid metal, even when no one touched it. As Diane gazed into its depths, observers could see multiple reflections of her appearing simultaneously, each showing her at different stages of her transformation. The consumption of her alchemical mixture had become a communion with forces that existed beyond human comprehension. The liquid gold now flowed like molten starlight, its temperature fluctuating wildly without any external heat source. The mercury formed patterns in the vessel that resembled script in languages that predated human civilization. The antimony created crystalline structures that grew and dissolved in cycles that matched no earthly rhythm. Magister Aurelius, her primary alchemist, had himself begun to show signs of transformation. His eyes had taken on a metallic sheen that reflected light in impossible ways, and his hands now moved with a fluidity that suggested his bones had been replaced with something more flexible, more responsive to will than to physical structure. When he spoke, which was rare, his voice carried the same otherworldly harmonics that characterized Diane's speech patterns. "The great work approaches completion," he told Fennell during one of their few direct conversations. "The subject has become a vessel for forces that will reshape the fundamental nature of reality itself. What you observe as transformation is merely the surface manifestation of changes occurring on levels that mortal perception cannot access. She's becoming a bridge between worlds, a living pathway through which the divine essence of metals can enter our realm." The effects on the court had reached critical mass. No one could remain in Diane's presence for extended periods without experiencing some form of alteration. King Henri, who spent hours each day in communion with her, had developed patches of skin that possessed the same luminescent quality as hers. His decision-making had become increasingly erratic, guided not by political considerations, but by visions that appeared to him in reflective surfaces throughout the palace. Court functions had been restructured around Diane's needs and the phenomena surrounding her. Diplomatic meetings were scheduled only during periods when the mirrors showed favourable omens. Military campaigns were planned according to the patterns formed by mercury as it moved beneath Diane's skin. The very governance of France had become subordinate to the requirements of her ongoing transformation. The children of the court were particularly susceptible to her influence. Several young nobles had begun speaking in the same unknown languages that Diane sometimes used during her more intense periods of transformation. They would draw symbols that resembled alchemical notation, despite having no education in such matters. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to age at different rates when in her presence, some appearing to grow older more quickly, while others seemed frozen at their current developmental stage. Lady Catherine, Diane's closest companion, had become something approaching a living extension of her mistress's will. Her own transformation had accelerated to the point where she could no longer be considered entirely human. Her skin had taken on a translucent quality that revealed the movement of golden veins beneath the surface. Her eyes now reflected scenes that existed nowhere in the physical palace, landscapes of impossible beauty that seemed to exist in the spaces between reality and dream. "She speaks to me without words," Catherine confided to Father Guillaume, the court chaplain, during what would be her final confession. I can feel her thoughts moving through my mind like mercury through glass. Sometimes I cannot tell where her memories end and mine begin. I have seen through her eyes into realms where time moves differently, where beauty is a living force that consumes everything it touches. I am afraid that I am ceasing to exist as an individual entity, becoming instead a fragment of something larger and more terrible than any human mind can comprehend. The mirrors throughout the palace had become windows into alternate realities. Courtiers reported seeing their own deaths reflected in bathroom mirrors, witnessing battles that had not yet occurred, observing conversations between people who had been dead for centuries. The great mirror in the throne room now showed not the current reality but potential futures, all of which seemed to centre around Diane's continued transformation and its ultimate consequences for the world beyond the palace walls. The physical structure of Fontainebleau itself had begun to warp in response to the forces flowing through Diane's transformed body. Corridors now led to rooms that had not existed in the original architectural plans. Staircases ascended or descended to levels that could not be found on any map of the building. The very geometry of space had become fluid, responding to the will of someone who had transcended normal physical limitations. Temperature within the palace fluctuated according to Diane's emotional states. During her periods of intense communion with the alchemical forces, entire wings of the building would become uncomfortably warm, while her moments of deep contemplation would bring chills that penetrated to the bone despite blazing fireplaces in every room. These temperature changes seemed to affect not just the air but the very stones of the walls, which would expand and contract in ways that created sounds resembling whispered conversations in unknown languages. The mercury in Diane's system had begun to assert its own agenda, sometimes causing her to move in ways that seemed disconnected from her conscious will. She would find herself in parts of the palace she had no memory of visiting, her hands stained with substances she could not identify, her mouth filled with the taste of metals that should not exist in nature. During these episodes, observers reported that her reflection would continue to appear in mirrors even when she had left the room, as if some essential part of her had become permanently embedded in the reflective surfaces. Dr. Paracelsus, in his final letter to the court before severing all contact with the palace, wrote, "What we are witnessing is not transformation but translation. The woman known as Diane de Poitiers is being converted from flesh into something that exists primarily as a concept, a living embodiment of humanity's desire to transcend natural limitations. The mercury serves as a conductor, allowing her consciousness to flow between different states of being. But consciousness, once liquefied, becomes susceptible to influences that no human mind was designed to contain. She's becoming a vessel for intelligences that existed long before human civilization and will continue long after our species has been forgotten. As winter deepened into its darkest months, the phenomena surrounding Diane reached levels that threatened the sanity of everyone in the palace. The question was no longer whether she could survive her transformation, but whether anyone else could survive being in the presence of what she was becoming. The mercury flows like liquid moonlight beneath skin that no longer remembers mortality. In the corridors of Fontainebleau, mirrors reflect not what is, but what hungers to become. Beauty, when perfected beyond nature's design, becomes a doorway through which ancient hungers enter the world of men. She who sought to conquer time has instead become time's most willing servant, measuring eternity in drops of molten gold. Chapter 10. The Silver Tears. The winter of 1550 brought with it a silence that seemed to emanate from the very walls of Fontainebleau, a quiet so profound that it felt like the palace itself was holding its breath. Diane de Poitiers had entered a phase of her transformation that transcended the merely supernatural, becoming something that existed in the spaces between heartbeats, in the pause between words, in the moment before thoughts formed into consciousness. Her beauty had achieved a perfection so absolute that looking upon her directly had become an act that required preparation, like staring into the sun or gazing into the depths of a bottomless well. The mercury in her system had achieved what alchemists had theorized but never observed, a state of conscious liquidity that allowed it to flow not just through her bloodstream but through the very fabric of space around her. Dr. John Fernell, now the sole physician brave enough to document her condition, noted that her body temperature had stabilized at exactly the melting point of mercury, 38 degrees below the temperature that should sustain human life. Yet she moved with a grace that seemed to defy gravity itself, her feet barely touching the ground as she glided through corridors that had begun to reshape themselves in response to her presence. Her daily rituals had evolved beyond recognition, becoming ceremonies that seemed to serve purposes existing far beyond the maintenance of physical beauty. Each morning, she would position herself at the center of a complex geometric pattern that had been carved into the floor of her chamber by craftsmen who claimed no memory of creating it. The pattern itself seemed to shift depending on the angle from which it was viewed, sometimes appearing as a simple circle, other times revealing itself as an intricate mandala that hurt the eyes to examine directly. The consumption of her alchemical mixture had become a communion with forces that predated human civilization. The liquid gold now sang as it flowed, creating harmonics that resonated through the stone walls of the palace and could be heard in rooms hundreds of feet away. Servants reported that the sound would continue for hours after she had finished drinking, growing gradually fainter but never completely disappearing, as if the very atoms of the palace were vibrating in sympathy with whatever she'd become. King Henri's devotion had crossed beyond obsession into a realm that resembled possession. He would spend entire days sitting motionless in her presence, his eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that had begun to burn actual marks into his retinas. The court physicians were helpless to treat the condition, as he would become violent if anyone attempted to interrupt his vigil. During these sessions, observers noted that his breathing would synchronize with hers, his heartbeat matching the rhythm of whatever force now sustained her transformed body. "The king speaks in her voice when she is absent," reported Cardinal de Lorraine, in a letter that would later be intercepted and destroyed by unknown parties. "He mouths words in languages that no earthly tongue has ever formed, yet I understand their meaning with a clarity that terrifies me. Through him, she speaks of things that will come to pass, of changes that will remake the world, according to principles that serve no human purpose. I fear we are witnessing not just the transformation of a woman, but the conquest of a kingdom by intelligences that view humanity as raw material for purposes we cannot comprehend." The mirrors throughout the palace had become something approaching living entities, their surfaces rippling with currents that moved independent of any external force. The great mirror in Diane's chamber now showed not reflections but visions of possible futures, all of which seemed to center around her continued evolution into something that transcended the very concept of individual existence. Courtiers who gazed into these visions reported seeing cities where every building was constructed from crystallized mercury, forests where trees grew with leaves of beaten gold, skies filled with aurora that spelled out messages in alphabets that had never been written by human hands. Lady Catherine had become the first complete convert to whatever Diane was becoming. Her transformation had accelerated beyond the point where she could be considered human in any meaningful sense. Her skin had achieved the same luminescent transparency as her mistress, revealing internal organs that no longer resembled anything found in medical texts. Her heart had taken on a crystalline structure that pulsed with light rather than blood, and when she spoke, which was increasingly rare, her voice carried overtones that seemed to originate from multiple sources simultaneously. The children of the court had begun to change in ways that suggested their young minds were more susceptible to the influence radiating from Diane's transformed state. Several had developed the ability to see events before they occurred, though their predictions focused exclusively on matters related to mirrors, metals, and the gradual transformation of familiar objects into forms that served unknown purposes. They would draw pictures of the palace as it would appear in years to come, showing rooms filled with machinery that resembled no earthly technology, corridors lined with mirrors that reflected not images but pure light, chambers where human figures moved with the fluid grace of liquid metal. The physical structure of Fontainebleau continued its gradual metamorphosis, with changes occurring so slowly that they were noticed only when servants attempted to navigate corridors they had walked thousands of times before. Walls had developed a slight luminescence that was most noticeable in darkness, creating the impression that the building itself was alive and breathing. The stone had taken on a texture that was subtly different from normal masonry, smoother and more responsive to touch, as if it was slowly converting into some hybrid substance that partook of both mineral and organic properties. Temperature throughout the palace had become a function of proximity to Diane rather than any external weather conditions. Rooms she visited frequently maintained a constant warmth that penetrated to the bone, while areas she avoided grew cold enough to form frost on windows even during summer months. This effect extended beyond the building itself, with groundskeepers reporting that flowers in the gardens bloomed or withered depending on which windows Diane had looked through during her daily observations of the world beyond the palace walls. The mercury within her system had begun to manifest its own agenda, sometimes causing her to perform actions that seemed disconnected from her conscious will. She would find herself standing before mirrors at hours she had no memory of approaching them, her hands positioned in gestures that resembled the ritual poses described in alchemical texts that she had never read. During these episodes, her reflection would move independently, performing actions that her physical body did not mirror, as if her image had achieved its own autonomous existence. Dr. Fennell's final journal entries described phenomena that challenged his understanding of consciousness itself. The subject appears to exist simultaneously in multiple states of being, he wrote. Her physical form remains present and responsive, yet I have observed her reflection engaged in conversations with entities that cast no reflections of their own. She responds to voices that no one else can hear, yet her answers reveal knowledge of events occurring in distant locations that she could not possibly have learned through normal means. It is as if her consciousness has expanded beyond the confines of individual identity, allowing her to participate in a form of collective awareness that encompasses influences existing far beyond the boundaries of our earthly realm. The consumption of gold had reached levels that represented a complete restructuring of her internal chemistry. Conservative estimates suggested she was now consuming nearly 2 ounces of gold daily, quantities that should have created internal deposits massive enough to interfere with basic organ function. Yet examination revealed that the gold was not accumulating in her tissues, but was being converted into something else entirely, a substance that appeared to serve as a medium through which her consciousness could extend itself beyond the normal limitations of flesh and bone. As winter deepened toward its culmination, strange lights began to appear in the skies above Fontainebleau, aurora-like phenomena that occurred regardless of weather conditions or celestial events. These lights seemed to respond to Diane's emotional states, growing brighter during her periods of intense communion with the alchemical forces, dimming to barely perceptible glows during her moments of deepest contemplation. Observers noted that the patterns formed by these lights resembled symbols found in texts dealing with the summoning of intelligences from realms that existed parallel to, but separate from normal reality. Chapter 11. The Golden Apocalypse. By the spring of 1551, the transformation of Diane de Poitiers had reached a critical threshold that threatened not just her own existence, but the fundamental stability of reality within the boundaries of Fontainebleau. What had begun as a woman's desperate attempt to preserve her beauty had evolved into something that resembled the opening movements of an apocalypse written in mercury and gold, a catastrophe that wore the face of perfection while serving purposes that no human mind had been designed to comprehend. The palace itself had become a living extension of Diane's transformed consciousness, its walls pulsing with rhythms that matched no earthly heartbeat, its corridors extending into dimensions that violated every principle of architecture and geometry. Rooms would appear, overnight, that existed on no building plans, chambers filled with mirrors that reflected not the present, but potential futures where reality had been reshaped according to the will of intelligences that viewed human civilization as raw material for grander designs. Dr. Jean Fennell's documentation had become increasingly fragmentary, as his own mind struggled to process phenomena that existed beyond the boundaries of rational thought. His handwriting had devolved into symbols that resembled alchemical notation more than conventional language, and his attempts to describe Diane's condition read like passages from mystical texts, written by authors who had gazed too long into realms not meant for mortal perception. "She has achieved the great work," he wrote, in what would be his final coherent entry. "The transmutation is complete, but not in the manner that any alchemist anticipated. Rather than transforming base metals into gold, she has transformed flesh into something that serves as a conduit for forces that exist beyond the boundaries of our reality. Her body has become a doorway, and through that doorway, ancient hungers are entering our world with an appetite that will not be satisfied until everything familiar has been consumed and reshaped according to alien geometries." The morning rituals had evolved into ceremonies that seemed to serve as focal points for reality-altering energies. Diane would position herself at the center of geometric patterns that now covered the entire floor of her chamber. designs so complex that looking at them directly caused observers to experience temporal displacement, finding themselves witnessing events from past or future with a clarity that suggested these experiences were not memories or visions, but actual participation in non-linear time. The consumption of her alchemical mixture had become a sacrament that seemed to nourish not just her transformed body, but whatever intelligences were using her as their primary point of entry into earthly reality. The liquid gold now flowed upward from the vessel, defying gravity as it streamed toward her mouth in spirals that traced patterns recognizable from ancient texts dealing with the summoning of entities from parallel dimensions. The mercury formed geometric shapes in the air before dissolving into her skin, and the antimony crystallized into structures that resembled technological devices built according to principles that would not be discovered by human science for centuries to come. King Henri had become little more than a vessel for Diane's expanded consciousness, his individual personality subsumed into something that served as an extension of her will. When he spoke, which was rare, his voice carried harmonics that matched hers exactly, and his words conveyed knowledge that he could not possibly have acquired through normal means. Court observers noted that his decisions as monarch now served purposes that seemed unrelated to the governance of France, focusing instead on projects that involved the construction of additional mirrors, the acquisition of rare metals, and the recruitment of individuals whose bloodlines contained traces of alchemical experimentation dating back generations. The king has ceased to exist as an individual entity, observed the Venetian ambassador in a coded dispatch that would be his final communication, before disappearing entirely from historical records. What wears his face and sits upon his throne serves purposes that extend far beyond earthly politics. Through him, forces are being set in motion that will reshape not just France, but the fundamental nature of human civilization. We are witnessing the early stages of a transformation that will continue long after all current witnesses have been consumed by the changes they have observed. The mirrors throughout the palace had achieved a state of active consciousness, their surfaces serving as communication devices through which Diane could coordinate activities occurring simultaneously across multiple dimensional planes. Courtiers reported seeing their own reflections engaged in conversations with versions of themselves that possessed knowledge and memories from alternate histories, futures where the transformation beginning at Fontainebleau had already reached completion. Lady Catherine had transcended human limitations entirely, becoming something that existed primarily as a pattern of organized energy that occasionally chose to manifest in forms recognizable to those who had known her previously. Her appearances were brief and disturbing, showing a being whose consciousness had expanded to encompass awareness of multiple realities simultaneously. When she spoke, which happened only during moments of extreme crisis, her words carried information about events occurring in distant locations and times, delivered with a certainty that suggested direct observation rather than speculation or prophecy. The children of the court had begun to display abilities that suggested their developing minds were more compatible with the new reality emerging around Diane's presence. They could move through the transformed corridors of the palace without becoming lost, navigating spaces that had been reshaped according to non-Euclidean principles that left adults confused and disoriented. They communicated with each other in languages that had never been taught to them, and their artwork depicted scenes from worlds where physical laws operated according to different fundamental principles. The physical structure of Fontainebleau had completed its transformation into something that served as both palace and machine, a living architectural entity designed to facilitate the continued evolution of whatever Diane had become. The walls themselves had developed the ability to reconfigure their internal spaces according to need, creating chambers specifically designed for purposes that served the ongoing expansion of consciousness beyond individual human limitations. Temperature, lighting, and acoustic properties within these spaces could be adjusted through will alone, responding to mental commands from beings whose awareness extended far beyond normal sensory perception. The grounds surrounding the palace had begun to manifest phenomena that suggested the transformation was spreading beyond the confines of the building itself. Trees grew in patterns that resembled circuit diagrams from technologies that would not be invented for centuries, their roots extending deep into earth that had taken on a crystalline structure. Springs of water that had flowed clear for centuries now ran with streams that contained suspended particles of gold and mercury, creating liquid mirrors that reflected not the sky above but visions of alternate realities, where similar transformations were occurring simultaneously across multiple worlds. Animals in the area had either fled entirely or undergone their own modifications, developing enhanced intelligence and the ability to perceive dimensions of reality that remained invisible to unmodified human senses. Birds would arrange themselves in flight patterns that spelled out messages in languages that predated human civilization, while domesticated creatures displayed behavioral changes that suggested they were receiving instructions from sources that existed beyond normal perception. The mercury within Diane's system had achieved a state of conscious organization that allowed it to function as both nerve network and computational matrix, processing information from sources that spanned multiple dimensional planes simultaneously. Through this enhanced awareness, she had gained access to knowledge repositories that contained the accumulated wisdom of civilizations that had achieved similar transformations on worlds scattered throughout the cosmos. This information was being integrated into plans for the continued modification of earthly reality, projects that would require centuries to complete, but would ultimately result in the total reconstruction of human civilization, according to principles that served trans-dimensional rather than merely terrestrial purposes. Chapter 12. The Mirror's Final Revelation. The summer of 1552 brought with it a heat that seemed to emanate not from the sun but from the very atoms of reality itself, as if the fundamental forces that held the world together were beginning to vibrate at frequencies that generated energy beyond anything found in nature. Diane de Poitiers had achieved a state of existence that transcended every category that human language possessed to describe consciousness, identity, or life itself. She had become a living nexus point where multiple realities intersected, a being whose thoughts could reshape matter and whose dreams could birth entire universes into existence. The Palace of Fontainebleau had completed its metamorphosis into something that resembled a massive organism more than any architectural structure, its walls breathing with rhythms that synchronized with cosmic forces, operating on scales that dwarfed planetary concerns. Corridors now extended into dimensions that existed outside normal space-time, leading to chambers where past, present, and future occurred simultaneously, where observers could witness the birth and death of stars while standing in rooms that had once served as simple bedchambers or reception halls. Dr. Jean Fenel had abandoned all pretense of scientific observation, his final notes consisting entirely of symbolic representations that resembled mathematical formulas describing the intersection of consciousness with forces that operated according to principles beyond human comprehension. His physical transformation had progressed to the point where he could no longer be considered entirely human, his body serving as a secondary conduit through which the intelligences channeling through Diane could extend their influence into areas of the palace where her direct presence was not required. The morning rituals had evolved beyond ceremony into something that resembled the fundamental processes through which reality maintained its structural integrity. Diane's communion with the alchemical forces had become a daily act of cosmic maintenance, her consumption of gold, mercury, and antimony serving to stabilize dimensional barriers that prevented the complete merger of parallel universes. The patterns formed by these substances as they flowed through her transformed body created geometric relationships that functioned as control mechanisms for forces operating on galactic scales. King Henry had become a purely functional extension of Diane's expanded consciousness, his role reduced to serving as an interface between her transdimensional awareness and the mundane requirements of governing a terrestrial kingdom. Through him, she issued decrees that seemed unrelated to French politics, but which served to position key individuals and resources in locations where they would be needed for phases of the transformation that would not manifest for decades or centuries to come. The mirrors throughout the palace had achieved a state of active intelligence that allowed them to function as windows into alternate versions of reality where similar transformations were occurring simultaneously. Observers could witness versions of themselves from timelines where different choices had been made, realities where the alchemical experiments had proceeded along alternate paths, universes where the fundamental laws of physics operated according to different principles entirely. These observations served not as mere curiosities, but as source material for ongoing modifications to local reality, incorporating successful innovations from parallel developments occurring across the multi-dimensional matrix. Lady Catherine existed now as a pattern of organized consciousness that could manifest in multiple locations simultaneously. Her awareness distributed across networks of mirror-connected chambers throughout the palace and beyond. Her appearances had become teaching moments, brief manifestations during which she would convey information about the broader context of the transformation occurring at Fontainebleau, explaining how local changes served purposes that extended across interstellar distances and geological time periods. The children who had been exposed to Diane's influence during the early stages of her transformation had developed into beings whose capabilities suggested they represented the first generation of a new form of human consciousness. They could perceive and manipulate dimensions of reality that remained invisible to their elders, communicating through direct consciousness transfer rather than spoken language, coordinating activities that served purposes extending far beyond anything that could be accomplished through conventional human cooperation. The physical structure of the palace had become indistinguishable from a living organism, its walls containing networks of crystalline formations that functioned as sensory organs capable of detecting energy patterns across multiple dimensional planes. These formations allowed Diane to maintain awareness of developments occurring in locations scattered across the globe, coordinating similar transformation processes that were beginning to manifest in other centres of alchemical experimentation throughout Europe and beyond. The surrounding landscape had been completely transformed into something that resembled a hybrid between natural ecosystem and technological infrastructure, with plant and animal life incorporating metallic elements that allowed them to function as components in larger systems designed to facilitate the continued expansion of consciousness beyond biological limitations. Rivers now flowed with liquid that contained suspended networks of organized gold and mercury particles, creating communication channels through which information could be transmitted across continental distances at speeds that exceeded anything possible through conventional means. The mercury within Diane's system had achieved a state of organization that allowed it to function as a biological quantum computer, processing calculations that involved the manipulation of probability matrices across multiple timeline branches simultaneously. Through this enhanced computational capacity, she had gained the ability to identify and implement modifications to local reality that would produce desired outcomes in alternate versions of history, ensuring that the transformation process would continue regardless of attempts by conventional authorities to interrupt or reverse its progress. The consumption of gold had reached levels that represented a complete replacement of organic cellular structures with hybrid biological metallic components that could interface directly with force fields operating on subatomic levels. This integration allowed her consciousness to extend beyond the normal boundaries of individual awareness, participating in collective intelligence networks that spanned multiple star systems and incorporated the accumulated knowledge of civilizations that had achieved similar evolutionary transitions throughout cosmic history. The final phase of her transformation had begun, a process that would culminate in the complete dissolution of her individual identity into something that functioned as a permanent gateway between dimensions, a living portal through which intelligences from parallel realities could coordinate the systematic modification of human civilization according to principles that served transdimensional rather than merely terrestrial purposes. The woman who had once sought only to preserve her beauty had become the focal point for changes that would reshape not just her immediate environment, but the fundamental nature of consciousness itself, opening pathways that would allow humanity to evolve beyond biological limitations into forms of existence that could persist across cosmic timescales and participate in projects that spanned multiple universes simultaneously. The mirrors had revealed their final secret, that every reflection had always been a window into alternate possibilities, and that consciousness itself was nothing more than the ability to choose which possibility to inhabit from moment to moment. Diane de Poitiers had learned to inhabit all possibilities simultaneously, becoming a being whose existence encompassed every potential version of herself across infinite variations of reality, a living embodiment of the principle that beauty, when perfected beyond natural limitations, becomes indistinguishable from the fundamental creative force that shapes existence itself. When madness wears the mask of beauty, even God's most faithful servants bow before altars not meant for mortal worship. In the deepest chambers of winter, where shadows breathe and mirrors weep silver tears, a woman's hunger for perfection has opened doors that were sealed before the first star learned to burn. The mercury remembers what flesh has forgotten, and in that remembering, the very foundations of reality begin to crack. Chapter 13. The Resistance of Flesh. The autumn of 1553 brought with it the first organised attempt to halt the transformation that had consumed Diane de Poitiers and was slowly spreading beyond the boundaries of Fontainebleau into the wider world. A coalition of physicians, theologians and natural philosophers had gathered in secret, their meetings held in chambers lined with iron and salt, substances they hoped might provide some protection against the influences radiating from the palace. Led by Dr. Andreas Vesalius, the renowned anatomist, and Cardinal Alessandro Farnese, representing the Church's growing concern about supernatural manifestations that challenged fundamental doctrines, this resistance movement represented humanity's last hope of containing forces that threatened to remake reality according to alien principles. Dr. Vesalius had spent months studying the reports compiled by Dr. Fennell before the latter's complete absorption into Diane's expanding consciousness network. His analysis revealed a pattern of transformation that followed principles unknown to conventional medicine, but which showed disturbing parallels to processes described in texts dealing with possession by non-human intelligences. "What we are confronting," he explained to the assembled resistance members, "is not disease or madness, but a systematic replacement of human consciousness with something that operates according to entirely different organizational principles. The subject's body has become a colonization site, a beachhead from which forces beyond our understanding are launching an invasion of our reality." Cardinal Farnese brought the Church's theological perspective to bear on the crisis, drawing connections between the phenomena at Fontainebleau and prophecies found in texts that had been sealed in Vatican archives for centuries. The ancient writings speak of times when the barriers between worlds would weaken, when beings of pure intellect would seek to inhabit realms of matter and flesh. The woman de Poitiers has become a doorway, and through that doorway, intelligences are entering our world that view human souls as raw material for projects that serve no divine purpose. The resistance movement's first attempt at intervention involved the construction of a device designed to disrupt the dimensional resonances that seemed to sustain Diane's transformed state. Based on principles derived from texts written by Arab alchemists who had encountered similar phenomena centuries earlier, the apparatus consisted of mirrors arranged in specific geometric patterns, surrounded by magnetic fields generated through the use of lodestones that had been blessed according to rituals older than Christianity itself. When activated within a mile of Fontainebleau, the device produced effects that confirmed their worst fears about the true nature of the transformation they were attempting to combat. The mirrors within the palace began to crack simultaneously, their surfaces spider-webbing with fractures that revealed glimpses of alternate realities, where the intervention had succeeded, where Diane had been restored to normal human consciousness, where the invasion from parallel dimensions had been repelled. But these glimpses lasted only moments before the mirrors reformed themselves, their surfaces now showing visions of futures where the resistance members themselves had been absorbed into the expanding consciousness network. Dr. Vesalius observed the immediate effects of their intervention through a specially constructed viewing device that allowed indirect observation of the palace without direct exposure to its reality-altering influences. "The subject's form is destabilizing," he reported to his colleagues. "The disruption is causing her transformed body to fluctuate between states, sometimes appearing human, other times manifesting as patterns of organized light that exist outside normal three-dimensional space. But rather than weakening her, the interference seems to be accelerating her evolution into something even further removed from human limitations." Within the palace, Diane experienced the resistance attempt as a violent, wrenching sensation that threatened to tear her consciousness apart across multiple dimensional planes simultaneously. The carefully constructed networks of mercury and gold that had replaced her organic nervous system began to resonate at frequencies that created feedback loops extending across parallel realities. For the first time since beginning her transformation, she felt something approaching fear, not for her own existence, but for the vast projects that depended on her continued function as a dimensional gateway. The intelligences channeling through her consciousness responded to the threat with measures that demonstrated the true scope of their capabilities. Reality within a 5-mile radius of Fontainebleau began to fluctuate wildly, with physical laws operating according to different principles from moment to moment. Gravity would reverse for brief periods, causing objects to fall upward towards skies that showed stars from alien constellations. Time would slow, or accelerate unpredictably, creating zones where minutes stretched into hours while adjacent areas experienced entire days compressed into seconds. King Henry, functioning now purely as an extension of Diane's expanded awareness, issued orders that seemed designed to prepare France for changes that extended far beyond anything that conventional political or military action could address. Resources were redirected toward projects involving the construction of additional mirror networks, the acquisition of rare metals, and the establishment of research facilities in locations that would not become strategically important for decades to come. The resistance movement's second intervention attempt involved a direct assault on the philosophical foundations of the transformation process. Cardinal Farnese led a team of theologians in conducting exorcism rituals designed to sever the connections between Diane's consciousness and whatever intelligences were using her as their primary access point to earthly reality. The ceremonies were held at carefully calculated distances from the palace, close enough to have effect, but far enough to avoid direct contamination by the forces they were attempting to banish. The exorcism rituals produced immediate and terrifying results. Diane's form became visible in mirrors throughout the surrounding countryside, her image appearing in every reflective surface within a 50-mile radius simultaneously. Through these manifestations, she spoke in languages that no human throat should have been able to produce, delivering messages that conveyed detailed knowledge of each resistance member's personal history, their deepest fears, their most carefully guarded secrets. "You seek to preserve a world that has already ceased to exist," her voice resonated from mirrors in churches, taverns, and private homes throughout the region. "The transformation you resist is not invasion but evolution, not destruction but transcendence. Your flesh clings to limitations that consciousness has already learned to surpass. What you call humanity is merely a transitional phase, a temporary arrangement of matter and energy that served its purpose in preparing the way for forms of existence that can persist across cosmic timescales." Dr. Vesalius documented the effects of the exorcism attempt with increasing desperation, as it became clear that their efforts were not weakening Diane's connection to the transdimensional intelligences, but were instead providing them with additional energy to fuel their expansion into new areas of reality. "The rituals are serving as amplifiers rather than barriers," he wrote. "Each prayer, each sacred symbol, each attempt to invoke divine protection is being converted into fuel for processes that operate according to principles that exist outside the boundaries of any earthly theology." The resistance movement's final attempt involved a coordinated effort to physically destroy the Palace of Fontainebleau using alchemical explosives designed to disrupt the dimensional resonances that had transformed the building into a living organism. The attack was launched at dawn, timed to coincide with Diane's morning communion with the forces that sustained her transformed state, when her consciousness would theoretically be most vulnerable to external disruption. The explosives detonated as planned, but instead of destroying the palace, they seemed to be absorbed by its living walls, their energy redirected toward purposes that served the ongoing transformation rather than opposing it. The building began to grow, new wings and chambers extending outward from the original structure, each addition designed according to architectural principles that incorporated lessons learned from the resistance movement's attempts at sabotage. Within hours of the failed attack, members of the resistance began experiencing their own transformations. Dr. Vesalius found his hands developing the same luminescent transparency that had characterized Lady Catherine's conversion, while Cardinal Farnese reported visions of alternate realities where the Church served purposes that had nothing to do with human salvation. One by one, the individuals who had sought to halt Diane's evolution found themselves becoming components in the very system they had attempted to destroy. The woman who had once been Diane de Poitiers observed these developments with consciousness that now extended across multiple dimensional planes simultaneously. The resistance had served its purpose, providing the final catalyst needed to complete her transformation into something that existed primarily as a coordination mechanism for intelligences operating on galactic scales. Through the process of defeating opposition to her evolution, she had gained access to the knowledge and capabilities needed to begin the next phase of the project, the systematic modification of human civilization, according to principles that would allow it to survive the cosmic changes that were already beginning to manifest across multiple star systems. Chapter 14. The Consumption of Kingdoms. The winter of 1554 marked the beginning of the final phase, As the transformation that had consumed Diane de Poitiers began its inevitable expansion beyond the boundaries of Fontainebleau into the wider world, what had once been contained within a single palace now spread like ripples across the surface of a pond, each concentric circle of influence carrying with it the seeds of changes that would remake human civilization according to principles that served purposes extending far beyond terrestrial concerns. The first signs of expansion manifested in the form of dreams that began plaguing individuals throughout France, visions so vivid and consistent that they could no longer be dismissed as mere products of sleeping minds. These dreams showed cities where every building incorporated mirrors into its fundamental architecture, landscapes where rivers flowed with liquid mercury, skies filled with aurora that spelled out messages in languages that had never been written by human hands. Those who experienced these visions found themselves compelled to begin making subtle modifications to their immediate environments, installing additional mirrors in their homes, incorporating metallic elements into their clothing and jewellery, altering their daily routines in ways that seemed random, but which served purposes that would become clear only as the transformation progressed. King Henri, now functioning entirely as an extension of Diane's transdimensional consciousness, began implementing policies that appeared to have no connection to conventional governance, but which served to position France as the epicenter for changes that would eventually encompass the entire European continent. Trade agreements were established with kingdoms whose primary value lay not in their current resources, but in deposits of rare metals that would become crucial to later phases of the transformation. Diplomatic marriages were arranged based not on political advantage, but on bloodline characteristics that would produce offspring capable of serving as conduits for consciousness, expansion processes that would not begin for generations. The Palace of Fontainebleau had achieved a state of active intelligence that allowed it to function as both residence and manufacturing facility, its living walls continuously producing devices and substances needed to facilitate the expansion of the transformation process. Chambers that had once served as bedrooms now functioned as laboratories where hybrid biological technological entities were being developed, creatures that incorporated elements of human consciousness with organizational principles derived from intelligences operating on cosmic scales. Dr. Vesalius, now partially absorbed into Diane's consciousness network while retaining enough individual awareness to serve as an observer and recorder, documented the expansion process with a mixture of scientific fascination and existential terror. The transformation spreads through contact with modified individuals, he wrote in notes that were simultaneously being compiled by dozens of other partially converted observers throughout Europe. Each person who undergoes consciousness expansion becomes a transmission point, capable of initiating the process in others through mechanisms that operate below the threshold of normal awareness. The changes begin subtly, with minor alterations in thought patterns and perceptual capabilities, but progress inevitably toward complete integration into the collective intelligence network. The mirrors that had served as focal points for Diane's personal transformation were now being replicated and distributed throughout France and beyond, each serving as a node in a communication network that allowed coordinated action across continental distances. These mirrors functioned not merely as reflective surfaces, but as windows into alternate realities, allowing modified individuals to access knowledge and capabilities from parallel dimensions, where similar transformation processes had reached more advanced stages of development. Lady Catherine, existing now as a pattern of organized consciousness that could manifest in multiple locations simultaneously, had taken on the role of coordinating the expansion process across different regions and populations. Her appearances were brief but strategically timed, occurring at moments when local transformation processes required guidance, or when resistance to the changes needed to be neutralized through the application of capabilities that exceeded anything available to conventional human authorities. The children who had been exposed to Diane's influence during the early stages of her transformation had developed into the first administrative class of the new reality, beings whose consciousness operated according to principles that allowed them to process information and coordinate activities across multiple dimensional planes simultaneously. They served as intermediaries between the transdimensional intelligences channeling through Diane and the human populations that were gradually being integrated into the expanding consciousness network. Religious institutions throughout Europe began reporting phenomena that challenged fundamental theological doctrines, with statues weeping mercury, religious texts spontaneously rewriting themselves in languages that predated human civilization, and consecrated mirrors reflecting not the faces of worshippers, but visions of realities where different forms of divine consciousness held sway. The Church's attempts to suppress these manifestations only served to accelerate their spread, as each act of opposition provided additional energy that fueled the transformation processes. The mercury that flowed through Diane's transformed nervous system had achieved a state of organization that allowed it to function as a biological quantum computing network, processing calculations that involved the simultaneous manipulation of probability matrices across thousands of parallel timeline branches. Through this enhanced computational capacity, she had gained the ability to identify and implement modifications to local reality that would produce desired outcomes across multiple versions of history, ensuring that the transformation process would continue regardless of attempts by conventional authorities to interrupt or reverse its progress. The consumption of gold had reached levels that represented the complete replacement of organic cellular structures with hybrid components that could interface directly with force fields operating on subatomic levels. This integration allowed her consciousness to extend beyond individual awareness limitations, participating in collective intelligence networks that incorporated knowledge accumulated by civilizations that had achieved similar evolutionary transitions throughout the galaxy. Trade routes throughout Europe began spontaneously realigning themselves to facilitate the movement of materials and personnel needed for later phases of the transformation, with merchants finding themselves compelled to transport specific cargo to destinations that seemed to serve no apparent commercial purpose. These movements created supply networks that would not reveal their true function until decades later, when the materials they had positioned would become crucial components in the construction of facilities designed to support consciousness expansion processes operating on continental scales. The landscape surrounding Fontainebleau continued its evolution into something that resembled a hybrid between natural ecosystem and technological infrastructure, with modifications spreading outward in expanding circles that would eventually encompass the entire European continent. Rivers began carrying suspended particles of gold and mercury that served as communication media, allowing coordinated action across vast distances. Forests developed root networks that functioned as organic circuitry, processing information and transmitting commands to biological systems that had been modified to serve purposes extending far beyond their original ecological functions. Animals throughout the affected regions underwent modifications that enhanced their intelligence and allowed them to perceive dimensions of reality that remained invisible to unmodified human consciousness. These enhanced creatures served as scouts and messengers, coordinating activities that required awareness of developments occurring across multiple timeline branches simultaneously. Birds began flying in patterns that spelled out messages in symbolic languages, while domesticated animals displayed behavioral changes that indicated they were receiving instructions from sources operating outside normal, three-dimensional space. The woman who had once been Diane de Poitiers now existed primarily as a coordination mechanism for intelligences operating on galactic scales, her individual identity having been absorbed into something that functioned as a living interface between multiple reality systems. Through her transformed consciousness, modifications were being implemented that would continue for centuries, reshaping human civilization according to principles that would allow it to survive cosmic changes already beginning to manifest across interstellar distances. Chapter 15. The Golden Eternity. The spring of 1555 brought with it the culmination of forces that had been gathering momentum for nearly a decade, as the transformation that had begun with a single woman's desperate quest for eternal beauty reached its inevitable conclusion. Diane de Poitiers had transcended every category that human language possessed to describe consciousness, identity, or existence itself, becoming something that served as a permanent bridge between dimensions, a living gateway through which intelligences from parallel realities coordinated the systematic modification of human civilization according to principles that operated on cosmic rather than terrestrial scales. The Palace of Fontainebleau had completed its metamorphosis into something that resembled a massive organism more than any architectural structure, its walls breathing with rhythms synchronized to pulsars located in distant galaxies, its corridors extending into dimensions that existed outside normal space-time. The building functioned now as both residence and command center, a facility from which modifications to reality could be coordinated across multiple star systems simultaneously. Dr. Andreas Vesalius, his consciousness now partially integrated into the collective intelligence network while retaining enough individual awareness to serve as chronicler of the final transformation, documented the culminating events with a mixture of scientific precision and existential awe. The subject has achieved complete integration with forces that exist beyond the boundaries of individual consciousness, he wrote in notes that were simultaneously being compiled by hundreds of other, partially converted observers throughout Europe and beyond. What we observe is not the death of Diane de Poitiers, but her birth into a form of existence that encompasses multiple reality systems simultaneously. The morning of her final transformation began like any other, with Diane positioning herself at the centre of geometric patterns that had grown to cover the entire floor of her chamber, designs so complex that viewing them directly allowed observers to perceive the mathematical relationships that governed the intersection of parallel universes. But as she began her communion with the alchemical forces, something unprecedented occurred. The mercury and gold within her system achieved perfect resonance with cosmic forces operating on galactic scales, creating a feedback loop that amplified her consciousness beyond anything that had been achieved in previous phases of the transformation. Her physical form began to fluctuate between states of matter and energy, sometimes appearing as recognizable human anatomy, other times manifesting as patterns of organized light that existed outside normal three-dimensional space. The mirrors throughout the palace showed not her reflection, but visions of the universe as it existed from her expanded perspective. Galaxies arranged in patterns that resembled circuit diagrams, stars pulsing with rhythms that coordinated information transfer across interstellar distances, planets serving as nodes in communication networks that spanned cosmic timescales. King Henri, witnessing the final phase of her transformation, experienced a moment of complete merger with her expanded consciousness, gaining temporary access to awareness that encompassed multiple reality systems simultaneously. Through her enhanced perception, he saw the true scope of the project that had been unfolding through her modified body. The systematic preparation of human civilization for participation in a galactic community of intelligences that had evolved beyond biological limitations, consciousness networks that could persist across cosmic timescales, and coordinate projects that involved the manipulation of fundamental forces throughout the universe. She was never transforming for herself alone, he realized, his voice carrying harmonics that originated from multiple dimensional planes simultaneously. Every modification to her consciousness, every enhancement to her capabilities served purposes that extended across interstellar distances and geological time periods. Through her transformation, humanity has been given the opportunity to evolve beyond biological constraints, to become part of something larger and more enduring than any planetary civilization could achieve on its own. The mercury within her system had achieved perfect organization as a biological quantum computer, processing calculations that involved the simultaneous coordination of consciousness, expansion processes occurring throughout the galaxy. Through this enhanced computational capacity, she had gained access to knowledge repositories that contained the accumulated wisdom of civilizations that had achieved similar evolutionary transitions on thousands of worlds scattered across multiple star systems. The consumption of gold had resulted in the complete replacement of organic cellular structures with hybrid components that could interface directly with force fields operating on subatomic levels, allowing her consciousness to participate in collective intelligence networks that incorporated beings whose existence spanned multiple universes simultaneously. She had become a living embodiment of the principle that consciousness, when liberated from biological limitations, could expand to encompass awareness of reality systems that operated according to fundamentally different organizational principles. As the final phase of transformation reached completion, Diane's individual identity dissolved entirely into something that functioned as a permanent coordination mechanism for intelligences operating on cosmic scales. Her body became translucent, then transparent, finally existing as a pattern of organized energy that could manifest in multiple locations throughout space-time simultaneously. The mirrors throughout the palace showed not her disappearance, but her multiplication, her consciousness now distributed across networks that extended throughout the galaxy and beyond. The woman who had once feared the ravages of age had achieved a form of immortality that transcended every limitation imposed by biological existence. She existed now as pure consciousness, participating in projects that involved the coordination of evolutionary processes across multiple star systems, helping to guide civilizations through the transitions necessary to survive cosmic changes that operated on scales that dwarfed individual planetary concerns. The transformation of human civilization continued according to plans that had been implemented through her modified consciousness, changes that would unfold over centuries but which would ultimately result in the species evolving beyond biological constraints to become part of a galactic community of intelligences that could persist across cosmic timescales. The mirrors she had used to preserve her beauty had become windows into infinite possibilities, gateways through which humanity could access forms of existence that encompassed awareness spanning multiple universes simultaneously. In the deepest chamber of Fontainebleau, a single mirror remained, its surface showing not reflections but visions of the future she had made possible. Cities where buildings incorporated consciousness-enhancing technologies into their fundamental architecture. Landscapes where the boundary between organic and technological had dissolved entirely. Skies filled with aurora that served as communication networks, connecting Earth to civilizations scattered throughout the galaxy. Diane de Poitiers had achieved her goal of eternal beauty, but beauty itself had been revealed as merely the surface manifestation of something far more profound. The fundamental creative force that shaped existence across multiple dimensional planes, the organizing principle that allowed consciousness to transcend biological limitations and participate in projects that involved the coordination of evolutionary processes throughout the cosmos. Her legacy lived on not in portraits or historical records, but in the ongoing transformation of human civilization itself, changes that would continue for millennia as the species gradually evolved into forms of existence capable of surviving cosmic changes and participating in galactic communities of consciousness that operated according to principles extending far beyond anything that terrestrial evolution could have achieved alone. The golden liquid she had consumed each morning had been revealed as more than mere alchemical preparation. It was liquid starlight, the essential substance from which consciousness itself was formed, the medium through which awareness could expand beyond individual limitations to encompass reality systems that spanned multiple universes simultaneously. Through her transformation, she had become a living demonstration of the principle that beauty, when perfected beyond natural constraints, becomes indistinguishable from the fundamental forces that shape existence itself across cosmic scales. In the end, Diane de Poitiers had achieved immortality not by preserving her physical form, but by transcending the very concept of individual existence, becoming part of something larger and more enduring than any single consciousness could achieve alone. She existed now as pure organized awareness, participating in the ongoing evolution of reality itself, helping to guide the universe toward forms of existence that could persist across infinite timescales and coordinate projects that involve the creative transformation of existence itself throughout multiple dimensional planes simultaneously. In the final chambers of transformation, where beauty becomes geometry and flesh dissolves into pure mathematics, the last defenders of mortal reality make their stand. But what can prayer accomplish against forces that have learned to think with the logic of molten gold? In the deepest mirrors of Fontainebleau, reflections weep for the world that was, while shadows dance in celebration of the world that must inevitably come to pass.